While my mother-in-law was popping a $500 bottle of champagne at the country club, I was sitting in a freezing medical clinic holding a piece of paper that said I was biologically worthless. My mother-in-law bought that diagnosis for $50,000. She paid a doctor to look me in the eye and deliberately strip away my manhood, my future, and my marriage. She told my wife to leave me, and my wife listened without a second thought. But 6 months later, that $50,000 bribe bought my mother-in-law a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. My name is Wyatt Sullivan, and I am going to tell you how the total destruction of my life became the absolute foundation of my greatest victory. The leather chair in Dr. Harrison Webb's office felt like solid ice against my back. I sat next to Abigail, my wife of 4 years, watching her hands tremble relentlessly in her lap. She was twisting her platinum wedding band around and around her slender finger, a nervous habit that always flared up when her anxiety peaked. Abigail wanted a child more than anything in the world. For the past year, our entire existence had revolved around basal temperature charts, strict calendar alerts, and silent, desperate prayers whispered in the dark. I loved her deeply enough to endure any invasive test, any sharp needle, and any humiliating clinic appointment just to see her hold our baby. But the air in that consultation room was heavy and suffocating. It felt less like a medical facility designed for healing and more like a high-stakes courtroom where we were waiting for a life sentence. Abigail came from the Sterlings. In our town, that name meant old money, massive generational estates, and undisputed political power. The Sterlings did not just have wealth. They had an empire built on decades of local influence. I came from a family of auto mechanics and factory workers. My father worked third shift on an assembly line so I could be the first in our family to go to college. I worked my way through State University, pulling late nights at a diner to pay for my textbooks, and eventually built my own independent accounting firm from nothing. I was incredibly proud of what I had built. I managed the finances for local bakeries, construction crews, and hardware stores. But to the Sterlings, I was nothing more than a peasant who had somehow tricked their wealthy princess into marriage. Victoria Sterling. My mother-in-law made absolutely sure I never forgot my place. At every Thanksgiving dinner, every charity gala, and every forced Sunday brunch, she found a way to demean my profession. She hated my modest domestic car, my off-the-rack gray suits, and my quiet, unpretentious life. She constantly reminded Abigail that a Sullivan could never provide the lifestyle a Sterling was born to command. But I endured the insults because I believed Abigail and I were an unbreakable team. I thought our love was a fortress that her family's toxic money could never penetrate. I was profoundly wrong. The heavy oak door swung open, and Dr. Harrison Webb walked into the room. He was not a normal doctor. He was the chief of reproductive medicine at the most exclusive private hospital in the state. He played golf at the same private country club as Abigail's uncle. He was a staple at Victoria's charity galas, always photographed holding a crystal flute of champagne. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit beneath his pristine pressed white coat, and the gold watch on his wrist cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. He sat down at his massive mahogany desk, folded his perfectly manicured hands over a thick medical file, and looked at me with a gaze so entirely devoid of basic human empathy that it made my stomach physically churn. He did not offer a comforting smile. He did not offer any gentle preamble. He just opened the folder with clinical precision. "Wyatt," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, and cold. "We have the results from your third round of comprehensive genetic testing and the specialized tissue biopsies. I am afraid the news is definitive." Abigail stopped twisting her ring. She leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes wide with desperate hope. Dr. Webb did not look at her. He kept his eyes locked strictly on me, pinning me down like a biological failure on a microscope slide. "You have a rare, irreversible genetic microdeletion," he stated, his tone flat and authoritative. "It is a severe chromosomal anomaly. You are completely infertile. There is 0% chance of you ever fathering a biological child." Medical intervention surgery or specialized fertility treatments will not change this reality. The damage is hardwired into your DNA. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Irreversible. 0% chance. I felt the blood drain rapidly from my face. My ears started ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the low hum of the office air conditioner. I tried to speak, to ask a question, to demand a second opinion, but my throat completely closed up. I was a man who solved complex problems for a living. I balanced complicated ledgers. I fixed massive financial discrepancies. I found logical solutions where others only saw chaos. But I could not fix my own genetics. I looked over at Abigail, desperately needing her to hold my hand, needing her to tell me that we would find another way. We could adopt a beautiful baby. We could use a donor. We could just rely on the strength of our marriage. But Abigail did not reach for my hand. She physically recoiled from me. She pressed her back hard against the armrest of her chair, putting as much physical distance between us as the small leather seat would allow. The look on her face was not just grief. It was absolute revulsion. She looked at me as if I had intentionally deceived her, as if I were a defective product she had accidentally brought into her perfect life. Before either of us could say another word, the heavy office door flew open again. It was Victoria. My mother-in-law stormed into the private medical office without knocking, wrapped in a designer cashmere coat, her diamond earrings catching the harsh fluorescent light, her heels clicking sharply and aggressively against the hardwood floor. In my state of shock, I did not even have the presence of mind to ask how she knew to be there. How did she know our exact appointment time? How did she know the precise moment when Dr. Webb would be delivering this devastating news? The timing was entirely impossible, but the crushing weight of the diagnosis had blinded me to the orchestrated reality unfolding right in front of my face. Victoria completely ignored my presence in the room. She rushed straight toward Abigail, pulling her daughter into a fierce, theatrical embrace. Abigail collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, her tears staining Victoria's expensive coat. "Oh, my sweet girl," Victoria crooned, stroking Abigail's hair with exaggerated sympathy. I know the pain you are feeling. The clinic called my private line. I came as fast as my driver could get me here. I am so deeply sorry you have to endure this horrific tragedy." I sat there isolated on my side of the room, entirely cut off from my own wife. I reached out a shaking hand. "Abigail," I whispered. "Honey, please look at me. We will get through this together." Victoria snapped her head toward me. Her eyes were like black ice filled with decades of suppressed hatred finally being unleashed. She kept one arm tightly around Abigail's trembling shoulders and leaned in close to my face. The scent of her heavy, expensive perfume was suffocating. She lowered her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper that only I could hear over the sound of Abigail's crying. "Do not dare touch her," Victoria hissed her words, slicing through the air like razor blades. "I always knew you were a working-class parasite, Wyatt. But this proves everything I ever said about you. You are a genetic dead end. You have absolutely nothing to offer the Sterling bloodline. You will not drag my beautiful daughter down into your pathetic, barren, mediocre life. Leave her alone. You are done here." She stood back up, smoothing her flawless coat, and turned her attention to Dr. Webb. "Thank you for your uncompromising candor, Harrison," she said, her voice suddenly sweet, polite, and dripping with high society charm. "You have done our family a massive service today. We will not forget this." Dr. Webb simply nodded, his face completely unreadable and devoid of guilt. "My pleasure, Victoria. Let me know if your legal team needs any further medical documentation." I felt like I was rapidly losing my grip on reality. My wife was weeping in the arms of a woman who was actively destroying my dignity, and my doctor was treating my life-shattering medical tragedy like a highly successful corporate business transaction. I stood up, my legs shaking violently, trying to process the sheer magnitude of what was happening. I was losing my future as a father. I was losing my fundamental identity as a man. And right in front of my own eyes, I was losing my marriage. Victoria firmly escorted Abigail out of the clinic, practically carrying her to my car in the parking lot. Victoria kissed Abigail on the cheek, shot me one last look of absolute terrifying triumph, and walked gracefully to her waiting luxury town car. The drive back to our house was the longest, most agonizing 30 minutes of my entire life. The silence inside the car was thick and suffocating. The rain started falling heavy and freezing cold, drumming aggressively against the metal roof. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a bruised white. Abigail sat pressed tightly against the passenger door, staring blankly out the window into the gray, depressing afternoon. "Abby," I finally said, my voice cracking under the emotional weight. "I am so incredibly sorry. But we are a team. We stood at the altar and promised each other forever, for better or for worse. We can look into private adoption. There are thousands of children who need a loving home. We can build a beautiful family another way. I love you more than anything." She did not turn her head. She did not blink. She just kept staring at the rain-slicked suburban streets. "Do not speak to me right now, Wyatt. Do not say another word. Just drive the car." The sheer coldness in her tone was not just the heavy weight of sadness. It was a reinforced brick wall, a massive impenetrable barrier built of old money arrogance and relentless maternal manipulation. In that passenger seat sat a woman I had spent 4 years fiercely loving, providing for, and protecting from the world. But the woman staring out the window was not the wife I married anymore. She was entirely Victoria Sterling's daughter. When we finally pulled into the driveway of the modest 3-bedroom house I had purchased with my own hard-earned accounting money, Abigail rapidly unbuckled her seatbelt before I even shifted the transmission into park. She threw open the door and sprinted through the freezing rain into the house. I followed slowly, my cheap dress shoes soaking in the muddy puddles, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. I walked through the front door and found her frantically moving around our master bedroom. She had pulled a large travel suitcase from the top shelf of the closet and was throwing her clothes into it with chaotic, angry energy. My heart slammed painfully against my ribs. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping cautiously into the doorway. "I am staying in the guest room," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any human emotion. "I cannot sleep in the same bed as you tonight. I cannot even look at your face right now without feeling sick." "But why?" I pleaded, stepping closer, desperately wanting to bridge the massive gap between us. "I did not do this on purpose, Abigail. I did not choose this genetic condition. You are acting like I maliciously betrayed you." Her smartphone lit up brightly on the wooden nightstand. I could see the glowing screen clearly from where I stood. It was a rapid-fire stream of incoming text messages from Victoria. The notifications kept buzzing relentlessly. Little digital commands from the ruthless matriarch, reminding Abigail of her high society worth, reminding Abigail that I was defective and useless, reminding Abigail that she deserved a purebred future with someone who belonged in her tax bracket. Abigail grabbed her phone, clutching it tightly to her chest as if it were a physical shield against me. "My mother is right," she said finally, turning to look me directly in the eye. Her gaze was completely hollow, emptied of all the love and warmth I had relied on for years. "You cannot give me the one thing I truly need to be happy. You cannot give me a legacy." She violently zipped up her leather overnight bag, walked right past me without a second glance, and marched straight down the hallway. I heard the heavy guest room door shut firmly. I heard the brass lock click sharply into place. That sound, the sharp metallic snap of the deadbolt locking me out, echoed loudly through the empty hallway of our home. I stood completely alone in the center of the master bedroom, surrounded by the life we had painstakingly built together. The framed wedding photos smiling happily on the wall, the carefully chosen oak furniture, the empty cold space on the mattress where she was supposed to be sleeping next to me. I felt completely broken, shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. I felt like an absolute failure as a husband, as a protector, and as a man. I sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress and buried my face deep in my rough hands, letting the tears fall in the silent, dark room. I honestly thought the brutal medical diagnosis was the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to me. I thought the suffocating silence and rejection from my own wife was the deepest, most agonizing pain I would ever experience in my lifetime. But I was incredibly naive. I did not realize that the devastating infertility diagnosis was just the opening move in a highly calculated, ruthless game of total destruction. The emotional distance Abigail put between us was just the convenient smokescreen Victoria desperately needed to execute her real plan. While I sat alone in the dark bedroom mourning the permanent death of my future children and the collapse of my marriage, my mother-in-law was already positioning her legal and financial pieces for the final kill. The emotional devastation of that afternoon was merely the cruel prelude to the absolute financial slaughter that would begin the very next morning. I had absolutely no idea that the solid ground beneath my feet had already been rigged by Victoria Sterling to completely explode. The morning light that filtered through the kitchen blinds was pale and unforgiving. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the entire night sitting at the small wooden kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, listening to the absolute silence of my own house. The guest room door down the hall remained firmly shut. Abigail had not come out to get a glass of water. She had not come out to check on me. She had simply barricaded herself away, leaving me to drown in the suffocating reality of my medical diagnosis. My eyes were burning. My chest felt like it was wrapped in tight iron bands, and my mind was racing in circles trying to figure out how I could salvage my marriage. I thought if I could just talk to her when the sun came up, if I could just remind her of the vows we took at the altar of our community church, we could find a way through the darkness. My desperate hope was shattered by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine pulling into my driveway. I stood up from the table just as heavy footsteps pounded onto the front porch. Before I could even reach for the doorknob, the front door swung open. Abigail had apparently left it unlocked. Walking into my home without knocking, without a shred of basic respect, was my brother-in-law, Trent Sterling. Trent was 30 years old, proudly unemployed, and drove a custom Porsche that was entirely funded by his trust account. He was dressed in a tailored navy blazer and expensive Italian loafers, completely out of place in my modest suburban living room. Right behind him was Victoria, her face set in a cold, calculating mask of absolute authority. Trent did not even wait to cross the threshold before the insults started. He looked me up and down, his lips curling into a cruel, arrogant smirk. "Well, look at the genetic dead end," Trent mocked, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet house. "You look terrible, Wyatt. But then again, I guess finding out you are biologically useless takes a toll on a guy." I clenched my fists so hard my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. "Get out of my house, Trent," I said, my voice hoarse from a night of silent crying. "This is my home. You do not have the right to just walk in here and speak to me like that." Trent laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "Your home," he repeated, stepping closer and aggressively invading my personal space. "You really still think you have any ownership over anything in this town? You were always just a temporary charity case for our family, a little experiment my sister tried out of rebellion. But the experiment failed, Wyatt. You failed on a cellular level." Victoria walked past her son, stepping into my kitchen with the cold precision of a general surveying a conquered battlefield. She placed her expensive designer handbag on the counter and looked around with undisguised disgust. She reached into her coat and pulled out a thick manila folder, dropping it onto the kitchen table, right where I had been sitting all night. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. "We are not here to exchange pleasantries," Wyatt Victoria said, her tone absolute ice. "We are here to finalize your exit from my daughter's life, and to make sure you understand exactly how thoroughly you have been outplayed." I stared at the folder, a deep sense of dread pooling in my stomach. "I am not leaving Abigail," I said, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. "We are married. We are going to work through this medical issue together. You cannot just command me to leave my own wife." Victoria smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression that did not reach her eyes. "You really are slow to catch on," she whispered, tapping her manicured fingernail against the manila folder. "Open it." My hands were shaking as I reached for the folder. I flipped open the heavy cover and stared at the documents inside. It took my tired brain a few seconds to process the legal jargon, but as a certified public accountant, the numbers and clauses eventually snapped into brutal focus. It was a formal notice of foreclosure. But it was not for my house. It was for the commercial property that housed my independent accounting firm. For the last 5 years, I had poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and savings into building my business. I bought a modest brick building on the edge of the historic district. I took out a substantial commercial mortgage to renovate the interior, update the technology, and create a welcoming space for my working-class clients. It was my absolute pride and joy. It was the physical proof that a guy from a poor background could build something lasting and successful. I looked up from the papers, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I have never missed a single payment on this commercial loan," I said, my voice rising in panic. "I am in perfect standing with the community bank. This is completely illegal. You cannot foreclose on an account in good standing." Victoria leaned forward, resting her hands flat on my table. "I do not do anything illegal, Wyatt. I just use the power of leverage. 3 months ago, I set up a private shell company under a different corporate name. I used that company to purchase a massive block of commercial debt from your community bank. Your little mortgage was bundled right into that portfolio." She paused, letting this horrific reality of her words sink deeply into my mind. "Once my company owned your debt, I legally became your primary lender. And if you had bothered to read the fine print of your original loan agreement, you would know there is a standard commercial acceleration clause. As your new lender, I have the absolute legal right to demand the full remaining balance of the loan at any time for any reason." I stared at her, completely paralyzed. "You bought my commercial mortgage just to destroy my business." I breathed out the sheer scale of her malicious planning, making me dizzy. "I bought your mortgage to ensure I had a leash around your neck," Victoria corrected coldly. "And today I am pulling the leash. You owe my corporate holding company $150,000. The payment is due in full within 48 hours. If the funds are not wired to that account by Friday morning, I will seize the building. I will seize your client servers. I will seize your office equipment. I will completely liquidate the only thing you have ever accomplished in your pathetic life." Trent leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms and grinning. "Good luck finding $150,000 by Friday, loser. Maybe you can sell some of your defective genetic material to a science lab. Oh wait, nobody wants that either." My entire world was collapsing with terrifying speed. Less than 24 hours ago, I was a respected professional with a loving wife, planning for a family. Now I was standing in my kitchen, completely infertile, facing the total annihilation of my career. Victoria had systematically targeted the exact foundation of my survival. She knew I did not have that kind of liquid cash available. She knew my savings were tied up in the house and the business. She had placed me in an inescapable financial death trap. "I need to speak to my wife," I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of profound grief and rising panic. "Where is Abigail? She needs to know what you are doing to me. She would never allow this." Right on cue, the guest room door slowly opened. Abigail walked down the hallway and stepped into the kitchen. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen and red from crying, but her posture was rigid. She walked straight past me, completely avoiding my gaze, and stood directly next to her mother. Victoria immediately wrapped a protective arm around Abigail's waist, pulling her close. "Abigail, please," I begged, taking a step toward her. Trent immediately stepped in my path, physically blocking me from reaching my own wife. "Please listen to me," I pleaded over Trent's shoulder. "Your mother bought the mortgage on my accounting firm. She is trying to bankrupt me. She is trying to destroy everything I have ever built. You have to tell her to stop." Abigail finally looked at me, but the warmth and love I had known for 4 years was completely gone. Her eyes were blank, completely indoctrinated by the toxic ideology her mother had spent a lifetime drilling into her head. "She is protecting me," Wyatt Abigail said softly, her voice devoid of any emotion. "She is doing what is necessary to fix a terrible mistake." A mistake, I repeated, the word hitting me like a physical punch to the gut. "I am your husband. We built a life together. We went on vacations, we celebrated holidays, we held each other when things were hard. You cannot just throw all of that away because of a medical diagnosis. We can adopt. We can use a donor. We can still be a family, Abigail. Marriage is about teamwork. It is about standing together when the absolute worst things happen." Abigail shook her head slowly, her face hardening into a mask of pure sterling arrogance. "You do not understand, Wyatt. You never understood how our family works. The Sterling name requires pure blood. My children must carry my legacy, and they must carry a legacy of strength. I cannot compromise my future for a man who brings nothing to the table but a broken genetic code." I stood completely frozen, the air rushing out of my lungs. The woman I had loved, the woman I had promised to protect for the rest of my life, was looking at me like I was a piece of defective machinery that needed to be discarded. She had completely bought into her mother's horrific worldview. She did not value my loyalty, my hard work, or my deep love for her. She only valued the biological function I could no longer provide, and the social status I never had. Abigail reached into her designer purse and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents securely bound in a blue folder. She held them out toward me. Trent snatched the folder from her hand and shoved it aggressively against my chest, forcing me to take it. "Those are divorce papers," Abigail stated coldly. "My mother's legal team drafted them early this morning. I am filing for an immediate dissolution of our marriage based on irreconcilable differences. I am asking for full possession of this house since my family provided the initial down payment assistance. You have zero claim to my trust fund, and you clearly have no business left to divide." I looked down at the divorce papers, the heavy black ink sealing my absolute ruin. "You are throwing me away," I whispered, unable to comprehend the sheer speed of her betrayal. "In less than a day you are throwing me away." Victoria stepped forward, her voice ringing with final authority. "You are going to sign those papers, Wyatt, and you are going to vacate this property immediately. You have exactly until midnight tonight to pack whatever cheap clothes you own and get off my daughter's property. If you are still inside this house when the clock strikes 12, I will have the local police physically drag you out for trespassing." I looked around my kitchen. The coffee mug I had used the morning before was still sitting in the sink. The calendar on the fridge still had our dinner date circled in red ink. My entire life was scattered across this room, and I was being commanded to abandon it all under the threat of absolute financial and legal destruction. I realized in that terrible moment that fighting them in this kitchen was entirely useless. They had all the money, all the power, and all the leverage. They had formed a unified, impenetrable wall of cruelty, and I was completely isolated on the other side. "Fine," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet whisper. "I will pack my things." Trent laughed mockingly. "Do not take too long, poverty boy. We have a professional cleaning crew coming tomorrow to scrub the scent of failure out of the carpets." I turned my back on them and walked slowly into the master bedroom. I pulled a cheap worn duffel bag from the bottom of the closet and started throwing my clothes inside. I did not fold anything. I just grabbed handfuls of shirts, jeans, and socks, operating on pure, numb instinct. I did not take any of the expensive watches Abigail had gifted me for our anniversaries. I did not take any of the electronic devices we had purchased together. I only took what belonged strictly to me before I ever met a Sterling. As I cleared out the top drawer of my wooden dresser, my fingers brushed against a small, hard object tucked in the very back corner beneath a stack of old receipts. I pulled it out. It was a small, heavily rusted safety deposit box key on a frayed string. It belonged to my late grandfather, a meticulous county auditor who had died under sudden and highly suspicious circumstances 5 years ago. He had handed me the key a week before his fatal heart attack, telling me to hold on to it. I had tossed it in the drawer and completely forgotten about it, too busy building my new life with Abigail to investigate an old man's secrets. Now it was quite literally the only thing of historical value I had left in the world. I slipped the cold, rusty key deep into the front pocket of my jeans. I zipped up the duffel bag, slung the heavy strap over my shoulder, and walked back out into the hallway. Abigail had already retreated back into the guest room, completely erasing herself from my departure. Victoria and Trent were standing by the front door, watching me with looks of supreme satisfaction. I walked past them without saying a single word. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The weather had turned violently worse. The freezing rain was coming down in thick gray sheets, bouncing aggressively off the pavement and turning the front lawn into a massive muddy swamp. The biting wind immediately cut right through my thin jacket, chilling me straight to the bone. Trent stepped out onto the porch behind me. He looked at my cheap, bulging duffel bag and smirked. He suddenly reached out and shoved my shoulder hard, causing me to stumble forward down the porch steps. I caught my balance just before falling face first into the freezing mud, but my bag slipped off my shoulder and crashed heavily onto the wet driveway, splashing dirty water all over my clothes. Trent stood safely under the dry overhang of the porch, crossing his arms and grinning down at me like I was absolute garbage. "Good luck breeding your poverty somewhere else, loser," Trent yelled over the sound of the pouring rain. "Do not ever show your face in our neighborhood again." The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, the loud, definitive sound cutting off any further communication. I stood completely alone in the freezing rain. My clothes instantly soaked my hands, shaking violently from the biting cold and the overwhelming shock. I bent down, picked up my muddy duffel bag, and slung it back over my shoulder. I had no business. I had no wife. I had no future. I had no car because Trent had conveniently parked his massive Porsche directly behind my sedan, trapping it in the driveway. I had absolutely no choice but to walk. I turned my back on the house I had spent 4 years turning into a home, and I started walking down the flooded suburban street. The cold rain beat relentlessly against my face, mixing with the tears I could no longer hold back. I was completely stripped bare, thrown out into the storm with nothing but the clothes on my back and a rusty key burning a hole in my pocket. Victoria Sterling thought she had completely destroyed me. She thought she had effectively buried me under the weight of her toxic wealth and her calculated legal strikes. But as I walked further into the freezing storm, clutching the strap of my bag, a tiny fierce spark of absolute survival ignited deep in my chest. They had taken my dignity and my survival, but they had not taken my mind. The smell of bleach and stale cigarette smoke clung heavily to the scratchy bedspread. I woke up staring at a water-stained ceiling that looked absolutely nothing like the immaculate home I had just been violently thrown out of. It was a $40 a night roadside motel on the absolute edge of the county line. It was the kind of desolate place you only end up in when you have literally nowhere else to go and no one left to call. My back ached deeply from the sagging broken mattress, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing psychological weight of the previous 24 hours. I had lost my wife, my future children, and my dignity in a single devastating afternoon. I thought I had hit absolute rock bottom. I thought Victoria Sterling had done her absolute worst by forcing me out into the freezing rain. I was completely wrong. The nightmare was only just beginning. At exactly 8 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated violently on the cheap particle board nightstand. It was a direct call from the local community bank where I held all my personal checking and professional business accounts. I answered the phone immediately, hoping to transfer some emergency funds to buy a decent hot meal and pay for another week at this miserable motel. Instead, I heard the tense, highly apologetic voice of the branch manager. He told me that every single account tied to my name and my independent accounting firm had been completely frozen. I asked him what he meant. I demanded an immediate explanation. I was a certified public accountant with a spotless financial record. I had built my reputation on trust and precision. I had never bounced a single check or missed a payment in my entire adult life. The manager cleared his throat, sounding terrified to even be speaking to me over the phone. He explained that a county judge had signed an emergency legal injunction at 6 in the morning. Victoria Sterling's high-powered legal team had filed a massive aggressive civil suit against me on behalf of Abigail. The court documents claimed that I had been secretly embezzling marital funds and heavily skimming from my own business client accounts for the past 3 years. I was completely paralyzed, sitting on the edge of the motel bed. Embezzling. I asked the manager what possible reason they gave for such an insane, life-ruining accusation. The answer made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. Victoria's lawyers had submitted forged financial logs to the judge claiming I had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay for illicit experimental infertility treatments on the black market. They painted a horrific, detailed picture of a desperate, defective man who was illegally stealing from his own wife and his hard-working clients to somehow fix his broken genetics. It was a complete and total fabrication. It was a brilliantly evil lie designed to completely destroy my professional reputation overnight. In the accounting world, trust is your absolute only currency. If the community thinks you are stealing their money, you are finished permanently. Victoria did not just want to bankrupt me and push me out of Abigail's life. She wanted to make sure I could never work in this state again. She wanted me to starve. I threw on the wrinkled dress suit I had slept in and rushed out to my car in the motel parking lot. I needed legal representation immediately to fight this injunction. I drove straight to the prestigious law offices downtown, the massive glass buildings that handled complex corporate litigation and aggressive divorce settlements. I walked into the very first firm, slapped my hand on the heavy mahogany reception desk, and asked to speak to a senior partner. The receptionist asked for my name. The exact moment I said, "Wyatt Sullivan," all the color drained instantly from her face. She made a quick panicked phone call, and 2 minutes later a junior partner came out to the lobby. He did not invite me into his private office. He stood in the public waiting area, crossed his arms defensively, and told me they had a direct conflict of interest. Victoria Sterling had apparently placed their entire firm on a massive retainer just last night. I left and immediately drove to the next firm. Then I drove to the next one. I visited 5 different high-end law offices before noon. The story was exactly the same everywhere I went. Every single reputable lawyer in the county was either already firmly on the Sterling family payroll or absolutely terrified of crossing Victoria. She had a total stranglehold on the local economy and the judicial system. No one was going to risk their lucrative career to defend a broke, disgraced accountant against the most powerful, ruthless family in the region. I was completely radioactive. Exhausted, freezing, and utterly defeated, I pulled into the cracked parking lot of a rundown diner on the industrial outskirts of town. I had a few crumpled dollar bills left in my leather wallet, just barely enough to buy a black coffee and get out of the biting, relentless wind. I sat entirely alone in a torn vinyl booth in the back corner of the restaurant. The tired waitress slid a chipped ceramic mug across the table and left a copy of the local daily newspaper right next to it. I wrapped my freezing hands around the warm mug, trying desperately to stop my fingers from shaking. I looked down at the newspaper on the table, and it felt like someone had driven a jagged knife straight through my ribs. There, plastered right on the front page of the society section, was a massive, full-color photograph of Abigail and Victoria. They were standing gracefully on the grand, sweeping staircase of the Sterling Country Club, dressed in custom designer gowns, holding expensive crystal glasses of champagne. They were smiling radiantly, their faces practically glowing under the bright camera flashes. The bold headline read, "Sterling Family Hosts Record-Breaking Charity Gala." But it was the smaller text, the caption right underneath the photo, that completely broke my spirit into pieces. It read, "Abigail Sterling steps out into a bright new beginning, leaving the past behind." A bright new beginning. Less than 24 hours ago, we were sitting together in a sterile medical clinic discussing our future family. Less than 24 hours ago, I was her deeply devoted husband. Now I was freezing in a cheap-smelling diner with frozen bank accounts and a completely destroyed reputation while she was drinking expensive champagne and posing for society cameras. She was completely unbothered by my destruction. She had erased my entire existence from her life with terrifying, calculated ease. She stepped right back into the luxurious, toxic embrace of her mother's empire, as if our entire 4-year marriage had just been a minor, forgettable inconvenience. I stared at her bright, smiling face until my vision completely blurred with tears. I had never felt so entirely worthless in my life. I had played by all the rules, worked incredibly hard, loved her fiercely, and stayed intensely loyal. And my ultimate reward was total annihilation. Well, look at this absolutely pathetic scene. I did not even have time to wipe the tears from my burning eyes before the cruel, grating voice echoed loudly across the quiet diner. I looked up sharply. Trent Sterling was standing right at the edge of my booth. My brother-in-law was wearing a custom leather jacket, smirking down at me with absolute unfiltered contempt. The diner was mostly empty, but the few patrons sitting at the front counter turned around to watch the confrontation. Trent did not care about causing a scene. He lived for the audience. He thrived on public humiliation and showing off his inherited power. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice tight with profound exhaustion and rising anger. Trent laughed a harsh, ugly sound and slid right into the booth opposite me, completely uninvited. "You are not exactly a criminal mastermind, Wyatt. You are driving a beat-up domestic sedan and drinking garbage coffee in the absolute worst part of town. You belong here. It suits your defective genetic profile perfectly. But I am not here to chat with the local trash. I am here for the keys." I stared at him across the table, completely confused by his demand. "What keys?" "The keys to your car?" Trent said, leaning forward and resting his elbows aggressively on the sticky diner table. "You see, when you bought that sad little sedan 3 years ago, my sister co-signed the loan. You needed her pristine credit score because your pathetic little accounting business was barely scraping by at the time. You paid the monthly bills, sure, but legally her name is printed right there on the title alongside yours." My heart dropped heavily into my stomach. I knew exactly where his twisted legal logic was going. My mother's lawyers are incredibly thorough. Trent continued, his arrogant grin widening into something purely evil. "They found a lovely little legal loophole this morning. Since Abigail is technically a co-owner, and since she filed an emergency injunction claiming you are a massive flight risk who is actively embezzling marital funds, the local court granted her full temporary possession of all shared assets. That includes your precious car." "You cannot do this," I said, my voice rising in a desperate, breathless panic. "That car is the literal only thing I have left in the world. My tools, my spare clothes, all my physical financial ledgers are locked in the trunk. I need that car to survive, Trent." Trent stood up from the booth, his face hardening into a look of absolute unapologetic disgust. "I do not care what you need, parasite. You do not get to drive a vehicle that belongs to a Sterling. Hand over the keys right now, or I will have the county sheriff arrest you for grand theft auto right in the middle of this diner." I looked out the diner window in a complete daze. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck was already idling in the parking lot, backed right up to the front bumper of my sedan. The tow driver was already hooking heavy steel chains to the undercarriage of my car. They had planned this entire execution perfectly. They had tracked me down using Abigail's access to the vehicle's GPS app, cornered me in a public place, and brought the executioner right to my front door. I slid out of the booth, my legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. I walked out the front doors of the diner and stepped back into the freezing, relentless wind. Trent followed right behind me, a smug, victorious shadow breathing down my neck. I stood in the wet, cracked parking lot watching the tow truck driver tighten the heavy metal chains. Every single piece of my adult life was locked inside that vehicle. My business laptop, my hard copy client files, the only clean dress shirts I still owned. "Let me at least get my work files out of the trunk," I demanded, turning to face Trent with clenched fists. "My clients have absolutely nothing to do with our divorce. You are ruining innocent people's lives and businesses by holding those accounting ledgers hostage." Trent snatched the car keys right out of my hand with a vicious lightning-fast swipe. "Your clients are not your problem anymore, Wyatt. Your firm is dead. Your reputation is dead. You are dead. Do not ever try to contact my sister again. Do not ever show your face in our town again. You are nothing but a biological mistake we finally corrected." He turned his back on me and walked over to his gleaming, expensive Porsche. The heavy tow truck engine roared aggressively to life, lifting the front tires of my sedan completely off the muddy asphalt. I stood there completely helpless and paralyzed as the tow truck pulled away. It dragged my only remaining lifeline down the street until it disappeared completely around the corner. Trent revved the massive engine of his sports car, specifically spinning his expensive tires to kick a thick spray of dirty puddle water directly onto my legs before speeding off in the opposite direction. I was left standing completely alone in the empty, freezing diner parking lot. The biting winter wind whipped harshly through my thin, damp suit jacket. My hands were entirely empty. I reached deep into my front pocket, my numb, shaking fingers brushing against the only physical object I possessed in the entire world. The rusty, cold safety deposit box key my grandfather had left me. I had absolutely no money to my name. I had no business to return to. I had no wife to comfort me. I had no reputation left in the community. I had no shelter other than a filthy motel room I could no longer afford to pay for. Victoria Sterling had systematically targeted every single pillar of my existence and violently knocked them down one by one. She had stripped me entirely bare, leaving me with nothing but the wet clothes on my back and the freezing air in my lungs. She thought she had broken me permanently. She thought she had completely erased Wyatt Sullivan from the map. But as I stood shivering in the desolate parking lot, gripping that rusty key in my pocket with everything I had left, the crushing despair slowly gave way to something else. It was cold. It was terrifyingly quiet. It was the pure, unyielding instinct of absolute survival. The smell of bleach and stale cigarette smoke clung heavily to the scratchy bedspread. I woke up staring at a water-stained ceiling that looked absolutely nothing like the immaculate home I had just been violently thrown out of. It was a $40 a night roadside motel on the absolute edge of the county line. It was the kind of desolate place you only end up in when you have literally nowhere else to go and no one left to call. My back ached deeply from the sagging, broken mattress, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing psychological weight of the previous 24 hours. I had lost my wife, my future children, and my dignity in a single devastating afternoon. I thought I had hit absolute rock bottom. I thought Victoria Sterling had done her absolute worst by forcing me out into the freezing rain. I was completely wrong. The nightmare was only just beginning. At exactly 8 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated violently on the cheap particle board nightstand. It was a direct call from the local community bank where I held all my personal checking and professional business accounts. I answered the phone immediately, hoping to transfer some emergency funds to buy a decent hot meal and pay for another week at this miserable motel. Instead, I heard the tense, highly apologetic voice of the branch manager. He told me that every single account tied to my name and my independent accounting firm had been completely frozen. I asked him what he meant. I demanded an immediate explanation. I was a certified public accountant with a spotless financial record. I had built my reputation on trust and precision. I had never bounced a single check or missed a payment in my entire adult life. The manager cleared his throat, sounding terrified to even be speaking to me over the phone. He explained that a county judge had signed an emergency legal injunction at 6 in the morning. Victoria Sterling and her high-powered legal team had filed a massive, aggressive civil suit against me on behalf of Abigail. The court documents claimed that I had been secretly embezzling marital funds and heavily skimming from my own business client accounts for the past 3 years. I was completely paralyzed sitting on the edge of the motel bed. Embezzling. I asked the manager what possible reason they gave for such an insane, life-ruining accusation. The answer made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. Victoria's lawyers had submitted forged financial logs to the judge, claiming I had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay for illicit experimental infertility treatments on the black market. They painted a horrific detailed picture of a desperate defective man who was illegally stealing from his own wife and his hard-working clients to somehow fix his broken genetics. It was a complete and total fabrication. It was a brilliantly evil lie designed to completely destroy my professional reputation overnight. In the accounting world, trust is your absolute only currency. If the community thinks you are stealing their money, you are finished permanently. Victoria did not just want to bankrupt me and push me out of Abigail's life. She wanted to make sure I could never work in this state again. She wanted me to starve. I threw on the wrinkled dress suit I had slept in and rushed out to my car in the motel parking lot. I needed legal representation immediately to fight this injunction. I drove straight to the prestigious law offices downtown, the massive glass buildings that handled complex corporate litigation and aggressive divorce settlements. I walked into the very first firm, slapped my hand on the heavy mahogany reception desk, and asked to speak to a senior partner. The receptionist asked for my name. The exact moment I said Wyatt Sullivan, all the color drained instantly from her face. She made a quick, panicked phone call, and 2 minutes later a junior partner came out to the lobby. He did not invite me into his private office. He stood in the public waiting area, crossed his arms defensively, and told me they had a direct conflict of interest. Victoria Sterling had apparently placed their entire firm on a massive retainer just last night. I left and immediately drove to the next firm. Then I drove to the next one. I visited 5 different high-end law offices before noon. The story was exactly the same everywhere I went. Every single reputable lawyer in the county was either already firmly on the Sterling family payroll or absolutely terrified of crossing Victoria. She had a total stranglehold on the local economy and the judicial system. No one was going to risk their lucrative career to defend a broke, disgraced accountant against the most powerful, ruthless family in the region. I was completely radioactive. Exhausted, freezing, and utterly defeated, I pulled into the cracked parking lot of a run-down diner on the industrial outskirts of town. I had a few crumpled dollar bills left in my leather wallet, just barely enough to buy a black coffee and get out of the biting, relentless wind. I sat entirely alone in a torn vinyl booth in the back corner of the restaurant. The tired waitress slid a chipped ceramic mug across the table and left a copy of the local daily newspaper right next to it. I wrapped my freezing hands around the warm mug, trying desperately to stop my fingers from shaking. I looked down at the newspaper on the table, and it felt like someone had driven a jagged knife straight through my ribs. There, plastered right on the front page of the society section, was a massive, full-color photograph of Abigail and Victoria. They were standing gracefully on the grand, sweeping staircase of the Sterling Country Club, dressed in custom designer gowns, holding expensive crystal glasses of champagne. They were smiling radiantly, their faces practically glowing under the bright camera flashes. The bold headline read, "Sterling Family Hosts Record-Breaking Charity Gala." But it was the smaller text, the caption right underneath the photo, that completely broke my spirit into pieces. It read, "Abigail Sterling steps out into a bright new beginning, leaving the past behind. A bright new beginning." Less than 24 hours ago, we were sitting together in a sterile medical clinic, discussing our future family. Less than 24 hours ago, I was her deeply devoted husband. Now I was freezing in a cheap-smelling diner with frozen bank accounts and a completely destroyed reputation while she was drinking expensive champagne and posing for society cameras. She was completely unbothered by my destruction. She had erased my entire existence from her life with terrifying, calculated ease. She stepped right back into the luxurious, toxic embrace of her mother's empire, as if our entire 4-year marriage had just been a minor, forgettable inconvenience. I stared at her bright, smiling face until my vision completely blurred with tears. I had never felt so entirely worthless in my life. I had played by all the rules, worked incredibly hard, loved her fiercely, and stayed intensely loyal. And my ultimate reward was total annihilation. Well, look at this absolutely pathetic scene. I did not even have time to wipe the tears from my burning eyes before the cruel, grating voice echoed loudly across the quiet diner. I looked up sharply. Trent Sterling was standing right at the edge of my booth. My brother-in-law was wearing a custom leather jacket, smirking down at me with absolute unfiltered contempt. The diner was mostly empty, but the few patrons sitting at the front counter turned around to watch the confrontation. Trent did not care about causing a scene. He lived for the audience. He thrived on public humiliation and showing off his inherited power. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice tight with profound exhaustion and rising anger. Trent laughed a harsh, ugly sound and slid right into the booth opposite me, completely uninvited. "You are not exactly a criminal mastermind, Wyatt. You are driving a beat-up domestic sedan and drinking garbage coffee in the absolute worst part of town. You belong here. It suits your defective genetic profile perfectly, but I am not here to chat with the local trash. I am here for the keys." I stared at him across the table, completely confused by his demand. "What keys?" I asked. "The keys to your car," Trent said, leaning forward and resting his elbows aggressively on the sticky diner table. "You see, when you bought that sad little sedan 3 years ago, my sister co-signed the loan. You needed her pristine credit score because your pathetic little accounting business was barely scraping by at the time. You paid the monthly bills, sure, but legally her name is printed right there on the title alongside yours." My heart dropped heavily into my stomach. I knew exactly where his twisted legal logic was going. "My mother's lawyers are incredibly thorough." Trent continued, his arrogant grin widening into something purely evil. "They found a lovely little legal loophole this morning. Since Abigail is technically a co-owner, and since she filed an emergency injunction claiming you are a massive flight risk who is actively embezzling marital funds, the local court granted her full temporary possession of all shared assets. That includes your precious car." "You cannot do this," I said, my voice rising in a desperate, breathless panic. "That car is the literal only thing I have left in the world. My tools, my spare clothes, all my physical financial ledgers are locked in the trunk. I need that car to survive. Trent." Trent stood up from the booth, his face hardening into a look of absolute unapologetic disgust. "I do not care what you need, parasite. You do not get to drive a vehicle that belongs to a Sterling. Hand over the keys right now, or I will have the county sheriff arrest you for grand theft auto right in the middle of this diner." I looked out the diner window in a complete daze. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck was already idling in the parking lot, backed right up to the front bumper of my sedan. The tow driver was already hooking heavy steel chains to the undercarriage of my car. They had planned this entire execution perfectly. They had tracked me down using Abigail's access to the vehicle's GPS app, cornered me in a public place, and brought the executioner right to my front door. I slid out of the booth, my legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. I walked out the front doors of the diner and stepped back into the freezing, relentless wind. Trent followed right behind me, a smug, victorious shadow breathing down my neck. I stood in the wet, cracked parking lot watching the tow truck driver tighten the heavy metal chains. Every single piece of my adult life was locked inside that vehicle. My business laptop, my hard copy client files, the only clean dress shirts I still owned. "Let me at least get my work files out of the trunk," I demanded, turning to face Trent with clenched fists. "My clients have absolutely nothing to do with our divorce. You are ruining innocent people's lives and businesses by holding those accounting ledgers hostage." Trent snatched the car keys right out of my hand with a vicious, lightning-fast swipe. "Your clients are not your problem anymore, Wyatt. Your firm is dead. Your reputation is dead. You are dead. Do not ever try to contact my sister again. Do not ever show your face in our town again. You are nothing but a biological mistake we finally corrected." He turned his back on me and walked over to his gleaming, expensive Porsche. The heavy tow truck engine roared aggressively to life, lifting the front tires of my sedan completely off the muddy asphalt. I stood there completely helpless and paralyzed as the tow truck pulled away. It dragged my only remaining lifeline down the street until it disappeared completely around the corner. Trent revved the massive engine of his sports car, specifically spinning his expensive tires, to kick a thick spray of dirty puddle water directly onto my legs before speeding off in the opposite direction. I was left standing completely alone in the empty, freezing diner parking lot. The biting winter wind whipped harshly through my thin, damp suit jacket. My hands were entirely empty. I reached deep into my front pocket, my numb, shaking fingers brushing against the only physical object I possessed in the entire world. The rusty, cold safety deposit box key my grandfather had left me. I had absolutely no money to my name. I had no business to return to. I had no wife to comfort me. I had no reputation left in the community. I had no shelter other than a filthy motel room I could no longer afford to pay for. Victoria Sterling had systematically targeted every single pillar of my existence and violently knocked them down one by one. She had stripped me entirely bare, leaving me with nothing but the wet clothes on my back and the freezing air in my lungs. She thought she had broken me permanently. She thought she had completely erased Wyatt Sullivan from the map. But as I stood shivering in the desolate parking lot, gripping that rusty key in my pocket, with everything I had left, the crushing despair slowly gave way to something else. It was cold. It was terrifyingly quiet. It was the pure, unyielding instinct of absolute survival. I pulled out the rusty key my grandfather had given me 5 years ago. I held it in the palm of my hand, letting the freezing rain wash over it. My grandfather was named William Sullivan. He was a man made entirely of rigid routines and quiet integrity. For 40 years, he worked as a senior auditor for the county. He was the kind of man who kept his receipts in color-coded folders and balanced his own personal checkbook down to the exact penny every single Sunday evening. Victoria Sterling absolutely despised him. Whenever his name came up at her lavish dinner parties, she would roll her eyes and loudly refer to him as a paranoid paper pusher who lacked the vision to make real money. She mocked his cheap suits and his practical shoes. But my grandfather never cared about high society vision. He cared about facts. He cared about numbers. Numbers never lied. Numbers never cheated on their spouses or fabricated medical records. 5 years ago, he died of a sudden, massive heart attack in his home office. The local police ruled it natural causes, but I always remembered how chaotic his desk looked that day. He had handed me this safety deposit key just 4 days before his funeral. He told me he rented a private storage unit on the edge of the industrial district because he did not trust the county archives with his current project. I was so young and so distracted by Abigail that I shoved the key in a drawer and forgot about the man who raised me. Now, staring at the rusted metal, I realized this key was the only physical inheritance I possessed. I had no car. I had no money for a taxi. The storage facility was located 4 miles away on the absolute farthest edge of the county limit. I gripped the heavy strap of my muddy duffel bag and started walking. I want you to understand exactly what it feels like to walk 4 miles through a freezing winter storm when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. Every single step I took felt like a physical punishment. The wind howled off the pavement, whipping the sleet directly into my eyes. My cheap dress shoes filled with freezing puddle water, causing my toes to go completely numb within the first 20 minutes. I walked past the wealthy gated communities with their massive heated driveways and glowing security lights. I walked past the exact country club where Victoria was probably sitting in a leather chair drinking her champagne and laughing about how easily she had erased a working-class parasite from her perfect bloodline. I walked past the pristine medical clinic where Dr. Harrison Webb had looked me directly in the eye and delivered a $50,000 lie. My legs burned with profound exhaustion. My chest heaved as I fought against the biting wind. I wanted to collapse on the side of the road and just let the winter storm bury me. I wanted to give up. The toxic words of my mother-in-law kept echoing loudly in my head, telling me I was a genetic dead end, telling me I was worthless. But the cold, rusty key pressed sharply against my thigh with every step, serving as a physical reminder that I was still breathing. I kept putting one freezing foot in front of the other, fueled entirely by the raw, blinding desperation of a man backed into a corner. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the industrial outskirts of town. The landscape shifted from manicured lawns to broken concrete chain-link fences and abandoned manufacturing plants. Finally, the faded neon sign of the self-storage facility flickered into view through the heavy rain. I dragged myself into the brightly lit main office, dropping my dripping duffel bag onto the cheap linoleum floor. The front desk manager was an older, heavy-set man sitting behind a thick pane of bulletproof glass. He looked up from a portable television screen and glared at me with deep suspicion. I must have looked like an absolute madman, soaked to the bone, shivering violently and clutching a rusted key. I walked up to the glass and gave him my grandfather's name. I told him I was William Sullivan's grandson, and I needed access to his unit. The manager slowly typed the name into a clunky desktop computer. He shook his head and let out a loud, annoyed sigh. "That unit is completely locked out," he told me, his voice muffled through the glass speaker. "The rental fees have not been paid in over 3 years. The total delinquent balance is well over $1,000. In fact, you are incredibly lucky you even walked in here today. That specific unit is scheduled for the public blind auction tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I am literally walking down there with bolt cutters in 20 minutes to prepare the inventory." My heart completely stopped. Tomorrow morning. Victoria's timing had been so ruthlessly perfect that I was less than 12 hours away from losing the very last piece of my family history. I pressed my freezing hands against the thick glass. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking with absolute desperation. "I am begging you. My grandfather died 5 years ago. I just found this key today. My business has been seized. My wife threw me out. I have absolutely nothing left in the world but what is sitting behind that metal door. Please, just let me look inside before you auction it away. I will empty it out for you. You will not even have to clean it." The manager stared at me, his eyes narrowing as he took in my ruined suit and my desperate, bleeding expression. He crossed his thick arms. "I run a business here, buddy, not a charity. You want the unit, you pay the $1,000. I reached into my damp pocket and pulled out my wallet. I took out the $10 bill and the 4 crumpled singles. I slid the $14 into the metal transfer tray and pushed it through the security slot. "This is literally every single cent to my name," I told him, looking directly into his eyes. "I do not have a bank account anymore. I do not have a car. This $14 is the absolute extent of my total net worth. Take it. Put it in your pocket. Buy yourself a hot lunch. Just give me 1 single hour inside that unit before you cut the lock. 1 hour to see what my grandfather left me. Then you can take it all." The manager looked at the wet, crumpled bills sitting in the metal tray. He looked back up at my face, reading the profound, undeniable truth in my eyes. He slowly reached out and pocketed the money. He typed a few keystrokes into his computer, and a heavy metal door buzzed loudly on the other side of the lobby. "Unit 412, he muttered, looking away from me. "You have exactly 60 minutes. When the timer goes off, I am coming down there with the bolt cutters, and whatever is left belongs to the facility." I picked up my heavy duffel bag and pushed through the security door. The main storage corridor was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast long, depressing shadows against the corrugated metal walls. The air smelled strongly of concrete dust and forgotten memories. I walked slowly down the long hallway, passing hundreds of locked doors, each one holding the discarded pieces of someone else's life. I finally stopped in front of a faded metal roll-up door with the numbers 412 painted in peeling black stencils. My hands were shaking so uncontrollably from the freezing cold and the surging adrenaline that I could barely fit the rusty key into the heavy brass padlock. I forced it in and turned. The lock resisted for a terrifying second before finally giving way with a loud metallic snap. I pulled the heavy padlock off and grabbed the metal handle of the door. I took a deep breath, hoping, praying, begging the universe for a miracle. Maybe my grandfather had left a hidden life insurance policy. Maybe he had left a secret stash of emergency cash. Maybe there were valuable family antiques I could immediately pawn to hire a defense lawyer and fight Victoria's emergency injunction. I grabbed the handle and forcefully threw the metal door upward. The heavy door slammed open, echoing loudly through the empty concrete facility. A thick cloud of stagnant dust immediately hit my face, making me cough. The automatic overhead light flickered on, illuminating a 10-by-10 concrete room. I stood frozen in the doorway, my desperate hopes instantly turning to ash. There was no money. There was no secret safe. There were no valuable antiques. The entire room was packed floor to ceiling with rotting brown cardboard boxes. The cardboard was severely water damaged at the bottom, and thick gray mold crept up the sides of the walls. It was nothing but mountains of discarded paperwork. I walked slowly into the center of the unit, staring at the chaotic mess. Some of the boxes had collapsed under their own weight, spilling their contents onto the dirty concrete floor. There were thousands of municipal tax ledgers, faded bank statements, stacks of yellowing county grid maps, and an old, heavy analog cassette tape recorder covered in a thick layer of dust. It was an absolute mountain of worthless garbage. It was the paranoid hoarding of an old auditor who could not let go of his job. I collapsed to my knees right in the middle of the filthy floor. The overwhelming weight of my entire reality finally crushed me. I had just traded the very last $14 I owned, the only money I had, for a hot meal or a bus ticket, just to buy an hour with a pile of literal trash. Victoria was right. My grandfather was just a pathetic paper pusher, and I was just a genetic dead end who had inherited his complete failure. I buried my face in my freezing wet hands and let out a raw, agonizing scream that echoed off the metal walls. I had lost everything, and my grand prize was a locker full of rotting paper. I sat there on the cold concrete for 20 minutes, completely paralyzed by a grief so deep I could not even breathe. I was ready to walk out. I was ready to leave the duffel bag, leave the boxes, walk out into the winter storm, and simply disappear forever. I grabbed my duffel bag, preparing to surrender. As I stood up, my heavy wet shoe violently kicked one of the collapsed cardboard boxes. The rotting cardboard tore open completely, spilling a dozen thick, leather-bound ledger books directly onto my boots. I looked down at the mess, feeling a sudden flash of profound anger. I bent down to aggressively shove the books back into the broken box. But as my fingers gripped the thick leather cover of the heaviest ledger, a small white sticker on the binding caught my eye. My grandfather had always used a very specific labeling system with a vintage typewriter. The white sticker read, "Hospital Board Expenditures Confidential Master File." I froze. The private medical hospital. The exact same hospital where Victoria Sterling sat as the highest-ranking member of the Regional Board of Directors. The exact same hospital that employed Dr. Harrison Webb. I dropped my duffel bag. I sat back down on the cold concrete floor, crossing my legs despite the freezing dampness of my clothes. I slowly opened the heavy leather cover. The pages were filled with my grandfather's meticulous, sharp handwriting. Row after row of exact financial figures, dates, and municipal routing numbers. I was an independent, certified public accountant. I did not need a computer program to understand complex cash flows. My brain was trained to see patterns, to recognize absolute financial truth where others only saw confusing numbers. I wiped the tears and the freezing rainwater from my eyes and started reading the columns. Within exactly 5 minutes, my professional training completely overrode my emotional despair. The numbers were not just random municipal records. This was a highly detailed shadow audit. My grandfather had been manually tracking the charitable donations flowing into the regional hospital board. He had mapped out the exact routing pathways of millions of dollars in federal grants and private community fundraising. I traced my finger down a column from 4 years ago, exactly 1 year before his sudden fatal heart attack. I looked at the incoming donation column. $5 million allocated for the new pediatric wing. Then I looked at the outgoing expenditure column. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The numbers absolutely did not match up. It was not a small, rounding error. It was not a municipal clerical oversight. It was a massive, glaring black hole. $3 million of that specific pediatric funding had been routed out of the hospital accounts and instantly paid to a private commercial construction firm for building materials. But my grandfather had attached a red ink note next to the vendor name. He had cross-referenced the construction company with the state registry. The company did not exist. It was a complete ghost entity, a shell corporation registered to a post office box in a neighboring state. I frantically flipped to the next page. Another charity grant for the oncology department. Another massive payout to a different mysterious supply vendor. Another red ink note from my grandfather confirming the vendor was entirely fake. I grabbed another ledger from the pile, tearing it open. The pattern repeated itself over and over again, spanning nearly a decade. Whoever was controlling the hospital board expenditures was actively systematically siphoning tens of millions of dollars out of the charitable foundation and washing the money through a complex network of untraceable shell companies. And sitting right at the absolute center of that financial web controlling the hospital board, approving every single one of those fake vendor contracts, was my mother-in-law, Victoria Sterling. The crushing despair that had paralyzed me just 30 minutes ago completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a burning, terrifying clarity. Victoria Sterling did not build her generational wealth through smart investments or inherited real estate. Her entire empire was a massive house of cards funded entirely by stolen charity money. My grandfather had not been a paranoid paper pusher. He had been a brilliant, relentless auditor who had quietly uncovered the biggest financial crime in the history of the county. He had found the exact mechanism of Victoria's toxic wealth, and he had documented every single stolen dollar in his own handwriting. And then he had died of a sudden, extremely convenient heart attack before he could hand the evidence over to the federal authorities. I looked around the damp, freezing storage unit. It no longer looked like a pile of rotting trash. It looked like an absolute goldmine. It looked like an arsenal of fully loaded weapons handed to me by a ghost. Victoria Sterling thought she was brilliant by freezing my accounting firm and destroying my professional credibility. She thought she had stripped me of my ability to fight back. She had orchestrated my infertility diagnosis, forced my wife to divorce me, thrown me out into the street, and taken my car, all to ensure I was completely helpless. But her arrogance had blinded her. She forgot that I was a Sullivan. She forgot that I knew how to read the numbers just like the old man she had mocked. I reached out and carefully picked up the old analog cassette tape recorder resting on top of the box. I wiped the thick layer of gray dust off the plastic casing. There was a single unlabeled cassette tape already loaded inside the deck. The conflict was no longer about simple physical survival. It was no longer about a broken marriage or a stolen car. It had instantly transformed into a high-stakes intellectual war. Victoria Sterling had spent the last 24 hours trying to completely bury me alive. But as I sat there in the freezing concrete room clutching my grandfather's meticulous financial ledgers, I realized she had made one fatal, catastrophic error. She had left me alone in a room full of her deepest, darkest secrets. And I was exactly the right man to expose every single one of them. I convinced the storage facility manager to let me borrow a rusted metal hand truck. I did not have a car to transport the boxes, so I had to move them by sheer physical force. I spent the next 7 hours walking back and forth along the shoulder of the freezing highway, pushing that squeaking metal cart through the pouring rain. 42 heavy cardboard boxes. I dragged every single one of them from the storage unit to my $40 a night motel room. The cheap plastic wheels of the hand truck got stuck in the mud, and my fingers bled from gripping the freezing metal handle. Cars sped past me, splashing dirty water onto my ruined suit. People looked at me like I was a homeless vagrant losing his mind. But I did not stop. I hauled the very last box into the tiny motel room and locked the flimsy wooden door behind me. The room was so incredibly small that the boxes completely covered the stained carpet. I had to stack them on the sagging mattress against the peeling wallpaper and inside the filthy bathtub. The entire room smelled like moldy cardboard, damp concrete, and 50 years of forgotten secrets. For 3 straight days, I did not step foot outside that motel room. I survived entirely on a loaf of stale white bread I bought from a local gas station with my last few dollars. I drank metallic-tasting water directly from the bathroom sink using my cupped hands. I did not sleep. I did not shower. I sat barefoot on the filthy floor surrounded by towering mountains of municipal ledgers, bank statements, and tax records. Victoria Sterling had stripped away my business and my pride, but she had completely forgotten what I actually do for a living. I am a certified public accountant. I have spent my entire adult life hunting down missing pennies in massive corporate tax returns. I am trained to look at thousands of pages of confusing data and instantly spot the lie. I do not need a warm luxury office or a powerful computer to track a financial bleed. Give me a cheap ballpoint pen and a clear ledger, and I can tell you exactly where the money went and exactly who took it. I stopped crying over my broken marriage. The blinding grief was rapidly replaced by cold, calculating obsession. I started pulling the files from the boxes and organizing them into chronological stacks across the floor. I opened the very first ledger. My grandfather had spent years quietly compiling public property deeds, bank liens, and municipal tax filings regarding the Sterling family. My entire marriage, I had been aggressively told that the Sterlings were untouchable royalty. Victoria constantly paraded her old money status, treating everyone else like disposable peasants. Abigail was raised to firmly believe her family had an endless flowing river of generational wealth. But as I sat on the floor and read my grandfather's meticulous handwriting, the absolute truth shattered that illusion into a million pieces. Numbers never lie. The Sterling estate was completely leveraged to the absolute brink of total financial collapse. The magnificent $4 million mansion they lived in had 3 separate massive mortgages taken out against it. The luxury vehicles were all heavily leased under predatory interest rates. Victoria was paying for her exclusive country club memberships and her designer wardrobe using a dangerous web of maxed-out commercial credit lines. She was drowning in massive, suffocating debt. She was absolutely desperate to maintain her high society facade. She needed millions of dollars in liquid cash every single year just to keep the banks from foreclosing on her entire life. She needed money, and she found an incredibly evil way to steal it. I pulled the next stack of boxes closer. These were the documents labeled Hospital Board Expenditures Confidential. Victoria sat on the board of directors for the Regional Medical Center. Because of her fake high society reputation, she had been given absolute unchecked authority over the hospital charitable foundation wing. I tracked the incoming donations column. Good, hard-working people in our community, local businesses, and grieving families were donating millions of dollars to build a brand new pediatric cancer center. They were donating massive funds to upgrade the neonatal intensive care unit to save premature babies. I slowly moved my finger over to the outgoing expenditure logs. The money was not going to hospital beds. It was not going to life-saving medicine for sick children. It was vanishing. Victoria was officially authorizing massive multi-million-dollar payouts to 3 specific commercial construction companies. The ledgers showed huge payments for structural steel, medical-grade plumbing, and architectural consulting that simply never arrived at the hospital. I grabbed a separate red folder my grandfather had carefully hidden at the bottom of a box. He had used his clearance as a county auditor to track down the state registry files for those 3 specific construction companies. I read the incorporation documents and my blood ran completely cold. They were ghost corporations. They had no physical offices. They had no employees. They owned absolutely zero heavy machinery. And the sole registered owner of every single one of those fake companies was my brother-in-law, Trent Sterling. Trent did not drive a custom Porsche because he was a successful, brilliant trust fund heir. He drove a Porsche because his mother was actively funneling stolen pediatric cancer funds directly into his private bank accounts. They were literally robbing sick children to pay for tailored navy blazers, country club champagne, and luxury vacations. The sheer absolute depravity of it made me physically sick to my stomach. My wife had violently thrown me away because I was a working-class parasite who could not provide a purebred legacy. But her purebred legacy was nothing but a massive, ruthless criminal conspiracy. I kept digging deeper into the final rotting box. At the very bottom, wrapped tightly in a yellowed plastic grocery bag, was the old heavy analog cassette tape recorder. Next to it was a small cardboard sleeve containing 6 standard audio cassettes. I walked over to the motel television, ripped the plastic cover off the remote control, and pulled out the 2 AA batteries. I pushed the batteries into the back of the tape deck. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I loaded the first cassette and pressed the heavy plastic play button. The small speaker hissed with loud, scratching static for a few seconds. Then a voice broke clearly through the silence in the room. It was my grandfather, William Sullivan. His voice was frail and tired, but thick with absolute righteous conviction. Hearing him speak in that dark, lonely motel room brought hot tears to my burning eyes. He was speaking directly into the microphone, verbally dictating his audit notes late at night. "I am recording this because I know they are watching my office," he said, his voice crackling through the cheap speaker. "I have found the missing $3 million from the winter charity drive. Victoria Sterling is authorizing the wire transfers herself using her executive board privileges. She is using her son Trent to wash the money through 3 fake supply contracts. I am compiling the final report for the federal authorities. The local police simply cannot be trusted with this evidence. Victoria essentially owns the local judges and the county commissioners. I have to take this straight to the Federal Bureau." I listened, completely mesmerized, for hours. I sat on the dirty carpet and listened to him meticulously describe every single fake invoice, every forged signature, and every single stolen dollar. He had built an airtight federal criminal case against the most powerful family in the county. But it was the very last tape in the sleeve that made my breath catch in my throat. I pushed the final cassette into the machine. My grandfather's voice was no longer calm and measured. He was breathing heavily, sounding terrified and rushed. "Someone was in my home office tonight," he whispered frantically into the microphone. "They went through my locked filing cabinets. Victoria knows I am running the shadow audit. She cornered me in the hospital parking lot this afternoon. She told me that old men who ask too many questions end up having sudden medical emergencies. I need to move the original boxes to the storage unit tonight. If anything happens to me, the evidence is locked away safely. I just need one more day to finish reconciling the final ledger. Just one more day." The tape suddenly filled with the loud, explosive sound of a heavy wooden door being smashed open in the background. My grandfather gasped loudly in pure terror. A heavy chair scraped violently across a hardwood floor, followed by a muffled shout. Then the tape cut out completely with a harsh, loud, metallic click. There was nothing left but dead white static. I sat in the absolute silence of the motel room, staring blankly at the spinning plastic wheels of the cassette deck. 5 years ago, my grandfather died of a sudden massive heart attack in his home office. Victoria Sterling had told everyone at the funeral that he was just a paranoid old fool who forgot to take his medication. The local county coroner, a man who regularly attended Victoria's lavish charity galas, signed the official death certificate without a single second thought. My grandfather did not die of natural causes. He was murdered because he was 24 hours away from sending Victoria and Trent Sterling to federal prison. She had killed the man who raised me. And now, 5 years later, she had stolen my business, stolen my wife, and tried to bury me in the exact same dirt. I looked around the tiny motel room at the towering mountains of paper. This was not a pile of worthless trash. It was a fully loaded weapon pointing directly at the heart of the Sterling Empire. My grandfather had done all the heavy lifting before he was killed. He had built the bomb. He just ran out of time to detonate it. He left that rusty key for me because he knew that one day I would be the accountant who could finish his final ledger. The conflict had completely shifted. I was no longer fighting just to survive the freezing rain. I was fighting to avenge a murder. I stood up from the floor, my mind sharper and more focused than it had ever been in my entire life. The heavy analog cassette tape clicked to a complete stop, filling the freezing motel room with a thick, deafening silence. I sat on the stained carpet, surrounded by 50 years of my grandfather's meticulous municipal ledgers, and felt the entire trajectory of my life pivot on a single terrifying axis. My grandfather had not died of a sudden heart attack. He was murdered because he had meticulously documented Victoria Sterling stealing millions of dollars from a pediatric hospital fund. He had built an airtight federal case against the most powerful family in the county. But as I stared at the yellowed paper documents spread across the floor, my professional accounting training kicked in violently, pushing past the overwhelming grief and the shock. These ledgers were incredibly damning, but they were also 5 years old. They proved the exact origin of Victoria's massive criminal conspiracy, and they proved exactly how my brother-in-law Trent was using ghost construction companies to wash the stolen charity money. But in the ruthless world of high-stakes corporate litigation, 5-year-old documents were a massive vulnerability. Victoria Sterling employed the most expensive, ruthless defense attorneys in the state. If I walked into a police station with only these old boxes, her legal team would instantly file endless motions to suppress the evidence. They would claim the statute of limitations had expired. They would claim my grandfather was a disgruntled county employee suffering from dementia. They would drag the investigation out for years while Victoria quietly moved her offshore money and destroyed any remaining evidence. I did not just need the origin of the crime. I needed the absolute killing blow. I needed hard, undeniable digital proof that Victoria and Trent were actively stealing that hospital money right now in the present day. I needed a direct current financial link that no highly paid defense attorney could ever possibly wave away. I reached into my muddy duffel bag and pulled out my personal laptop. It was a cheap heavy machine I kept as a backup, but it was fully operational. I set it down on the sagging motel bed and connected to the incredibly slow, unsecured wireless network of the roadside inn. Just 12 hours ago, Victoria had used a corrupt local judge to file an emergency legal injunction. She had completely frozen my accounting firm. She had legally locked the doors to my office, seized my business assets, and ordered the bank to freeze my servers. She thought she had completely severed my access to the financial world. She thought she had trapped me outside the walls of my own livelihood. But Victoria Sterling was an arrogant old money socialite who fundamentally did not understand how modern financial technology actually worked. She thought a piece of paper signed by a local judge was an impenetrable fortress. She did not realize that I had built my independent accounting firm entirely from scratch. I had personally written the code for my secure servers. I had designed the encrypted cloud architecture that held all of my municipal and commercial data. And because I always planned for catastrophic system failures, I had programmed a deeply hidden digital backdoor into the mainframe. It was a fail-safe access point that completely bypassed the standard login portals and the bank-mandated security freezes. I opened the terminal on my laptop and began typing frantically. My fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by pure blinding adrenaline and the desperate need for absolute justice. I bypassed the frozen front gate of my company server, completely ignoring the bold, red legal warning flashing across my screen. I dropped directly into the raw, unrestricted data stream of my accounting firm. I now had total, unimpeded access to every single municipal tax registry, commercial vendor database, and public banking ledger in the entire county. I placed my grandfather's handwritten notes right next to my glowing laptop screen. I typed in the exact routing numbers and the fake corporate names of Trent's ghost construction companies. I set up a complex cross-referencing matrix instructing my software to scan the last 30 days of the regional hospital board's outgoing wire transfers. I hit the execute key and held my breath. The screen went totally dark for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a massive cascading wall of green data flooded the monitor. My grandfather was right. The theft had not stopped when he died. It had exponentially accelerated. Right there on the screen, glowing in undeniable digital ink, were dozens of massive outgoing wire transfers initiated just last week. Victoria was still sitting on the hospital board, and she was still authorizing multi-million-dollar payouts for pediatric medical supplies and oncology ward renovations that simply did not exist. The money was bleeding out of the charity foundation and flowing straight into Trent's dummy corporations. It was a constant, aggressive hemorrhage of stolen community wealth. I had the current proof. I had the exact banking pathways. But as a forensic accountant, my eyes are always drawn to the anomalies. I do not just look at the massive numbers. I look at the single thread that does not perfectly match the fabric of the fraud. I scrolled rapidly through the list of massive construction payouts, and suddenly I stopped. There was a single isolated wire transfer buried deep in the middle of a massive block of payments. It stood out because it was not routed to one of Trent's fake steel or plumbing companies. It was routed through a totally different newly created Sterling Shell Corporation. And the amount was completely wrong for a commercial construction invoice. It was exactly $50,000. Not a penny more, not a penny less. It was a perfectly round flat number, and it had been completely scrubbed of any internal billing descriptions. My heart started pounding a heavy, erratic rhythm against my ribs. In the world of corporate auditing, a perfectly round $50,000 payment with zero listed invoice details is a massive red flag. It is the exact universal footprint of a direct bribe. I highlighted the routing number of the destination account. The money had not gone to a local vendor. It had bounced through a digital clearinghouse in Delaware and then vanished into an offshore private wealth management account located in the Cayman Islands. Whoever received this $50,000 had gone to extreme lengths to ensure the money was absolutely untraceable, but they were dealing with Wyatt Sullivan, and I was fighting for my entire existence. I ran a reverse trace on the offshore routing node. I hacked into the state medical licensing database and the International Registry of Domestic Corporate Beneficiaries. I spent 4 grueling hours running complex algorithms, breaking down firewalls, and tearing away the layers of digital camouflage hiding the owner of that offshore account. Finally, the encryption cracked. The true beneficiary name flashed in bold white letters across my dark screen. Harrison Webb, Medical Consulting, LLC. I stopped breathing. The air completely left my lungs, and the tiny, miserable motel room suddenly started spinning. Dr. Harrison Webb, the polished elite chief of reproductive medicine. The man who wore custom Italian suits and drank expensive champagne at Victoria's charity galas. The man who had looked me directly in the eye just yesterday morning and told me I was a biological failure. My trembling fingers reached out and touched the laptop screen, tracing the date of the $50,000 wire transfer. Tuesday, October 12th. I stared at the timestamp until the numbers completely burned themselves into my retinas. Tuesday, October 12th, was exactly 48 hours before Abigail and I sat in that freezing medical clinic. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. The crushing medical diagnosis was a total lie. I did not have a rare, irreversible genetic microdeletion. My chromosomes were not defective. I was not completely infertile. My entire medical chart had been completely fabricated. Victoria Sterling had wired $50,000 in stolen charity money to a deeply corrupt private doctor strictly to buy a fake laboratory result. A guttural, agonizing sob tore its way out of my throat. For the last 24 hours, I had been completely consumed by a toxic, suffocating shame. I had believed I was broken on a cellular level. I had believed I was uniquely incapable of giving my wife the family she so desperately wanted. I had spent an entire night sitting in the dark, weeping over the phantom faces of the children I thought I could never physically create. And it was all an incredibly malicious, manufactured illusion. My body was perfectly fine. My future was perfectly intact. My mother-in-law had simply paid a physician to look me in the eye and mentally castrate me. But as the initial overwhelming shock began to fade, a new, terrifying question emerged from the darkness of my mind. Why? Victoria Sterling had always passionately hated me. From the very first day I met Abigail, Victoria had made it brutally clear that a working-class accountant had absolutely no place in her elite family tree. She despised my modest background, and she mocked my profession. But she had tolerated my presence for 4 years. She had spent 4 years throwing passive-aggressive insults and making me feel small, but she had never taken direct catastrophic action to destroy the marriage. So why execute this massive nuclear strike right now? Why take the massive legal risk of bribing a medical official and framing me for embezzlement on this exact week? I closed my eyes and forced my mind to replay the last few months of my life. I sifted through every single dinner conversation, every forced family gathering, every passing interaction with Victoria. And then, like a lightning strike illuminating a dark room, I remembered a Sunday family dinner exactly 3 weeks ago. We were sitting in this massive formal dining room of the Sterling estate. Abigail had been complaining about the complicated tax forms for her small interior design business. I had gently offered to manage the filings for her, and then, trying to be helpful, I had turned to Victoria. I had casually mentioned that while I was pulling public property records for a client, I had accidentally noticed some massive glaring discrepancies in the municipal tax assessments regarding the regional hospital board. I had playfully suggested that whoever was balancing the hospital foundation ledgers was either completely incompetent or actively hiding a massive cash bleed. I had offered to take a look at the trust documents and fix the problem for her completely free of charge. I remembered exactly what happened next. Victoria had completely frozen. Her hand had shaken so violently that she spilled her expensive red wine all over the pristine white tablecloth. At the time, I thought she was simply insulted that a lowly accountant was questioning the financial integrity of her prestigious hospital board. I thought it was just her standard old money arrogance. But sitting here now in the cold motel room surrounded by the absolute proof of her massive criminal enterprise, I finally understood the truth. It was not arrogance. It was pure, unadulterated terror. Victoria was absolutely terrified of me. She did not orchestrate my fake infertility diagnosis simply because she wanted a richer son-in-law. She orchestrated my destruction because my professional competence was a ticking time bomb pointed directly at her entire empire. As a certified public accountant sitting right in the middle of her family, I was an extreme liability. I was a man who solved complex financial puzzles for a living. It was only a matter of time before my trained eyes naturally wandered into the deep shadows of the Sterling family trusts. It was only a matter of time before I saw the massive gaping holes in her wealth and followed the bloody trail of stolen pediatric charity funds straight to her front door. My grandfather had been a county auditor, and he had figured it out. Victoria had silenced him permanently. But then Abigail had married an accountant. Victoria must have felt like a terrifying ghost had returned to haunt her. She knew she could not just have me killed like my grandfather. Too many people knew me. My sudden death would immediately trigger a massive police investigation and draw unwanted attention to Abigail. Victoria needed a way to completely sever my legal and social ties to the Sterling family without drawing any suspicion. She needed to forcefully eject me from Abigail's life and ensure I was totally discredited so that if I ever did try to expose her financial crimes, nobody would ever believe me. She could not just tell Abigail to leave me. Abigail loved me. We had a strong, loyal marriage. Victoria needed a weapon so incredibly devastating that it would force Abigail to willingly, violently discard me on her own. Victoria knew that Abigail's greatest, deepest desire in life was to carry a biological child and pass down the Sterling legacy. So Victoria weaponized that exact desire. She paid Dr. Harrison Webb $50,000 to permanently label me as a genetic dead end. She knew that a diagnosis of absolute permanent infertility would completely shatter Abigail's spirit. She knew Abigail would view me not as a husband, but as a biological failure. And Victoria had timed it perfectly. She planted the fake diagnosis. She watched my marriage instantaneously collapse. Then, before I could even catch my breath, she triggered the secondary trap. She bought my commercial mortgage, called in the massive debt, and used her corrupt lawyers to frame me for embezzling marital funds to pay for fake medical treatments. She created a perfect airtight narrative. Wyatt Sullivan was not a whistleblower. He was just a desperate, broken, infertile man who stole money from his wife and his clients because his genetics were failing. It was a flawlessly evil master plan designed to completely obliterate my credibility, my marriage, and my entire existence in a single coordinated strike. I stared at the laptop screen, looking at the offshore wire transfer that proved every single piece of this horrific puzzle. My entire body began to shake, but it was no longer from the freezing cold or the crushing despair. It was from a deep, terrifying rage that burned hotter than the sun. My wife had walked away from our vows because she chose the comfort of her toxic family over the truth of our love. My mother-in-law had played God with my biology and attempted to bury me alive to protect her stolen wealth. Trent had laughed in my face and thrown my life onto a wet driveway while driving a sports car funded by children with cancer. They thought they had completely won. They thought they had driven a stake through my heart and left me to rot in this miserable motel room. They believed that a working-class man, stripped of his money and his reputation, would simply lay down and quietly disappear. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had pushed me into the abyss, but they forgot to make sure I was actually dead. They had given me absolute nothing left to lose, which meant I now had absolutely nothing left to fear. I reached out and gently closed the heavy leather cover of my grandfather's ledger. I carefully unplugged the analog cassette tape recorder and packed it safely into my damp duffel bag alongside my laptop. I did not need to run anymore. I did not need to hide. I had the origin of the crime from a murdered auditor, and I had the current undeniable digital proof of a corrupt physician taking a massive bribe. I walked over to the filthy motel bathroom sink and splashed freezing cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I was no longer the broken, weeping man who had walked out of that medical clinic. I was a completely different person, entirely forged in the fires of their profound betrayal. I dried my face, grabbed my bag, and walked out of the tiny room. The storm outside had finally stopped, and the freezing morning air felt sharp and clear. I was going to take everything from them. I was going to rip the Sterling Empire down to the very last brick, and I knew exactly which door to kick down first. I packed the heavy leather ledgers, the forged vendor invoices, and the old analog tape recorder into my damp duffel bag. I knew with absolute certainty that I could not walk into the local municipal police department. Victoria Sterling essentially owned the local police chief. She funded his re-election campaigns and invited him to her exclusive dinners. She owned the county judges who signed her eviction notices. If I handed this massive pile of incriminating evidence to the wrong uniformed officer, it would disappear into a shredder forever, and I would end up exactly like my grandfather, dead from a highly convenient sudden medical emergency. I needed someone who operated entirely outside of Victoria's toxic financial payroll. I needed someone who still possessed a basic moral compass. I needed Sheriff Brody Carter. Brody Carter was a grizzled old-school county sheriff who operated out of a small concrete precinct on the very edge of the county line. More importantly, he was my grandfather's closest friend 30 years ago, before the corrupt politics of the town forced them apart. I walked through the freezing rain for another hour until I reached the small, dilapidated precinct. I walked right into the dusty lobby and demanded to see him. When Sheriff Carter walked out from the back rooms holding a cup of stale black coffee, he stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at my face and saw the exact same stubborn jawline and tired eyes of the man he used to fish with decades ago. He brought me into his private back office and securely locked the heavy wooden door behind us. I did not waste any time with tears or emotional apologies. I unzipped the muddy duffel bag and emptied 50 years of stolen secrets directly onto his battered metal desk. I played the audio cassette tape, letting my grandfather's frantic, terrified voice fill the small room. I showed him the forged commercial construction invoices that proved Victoria was stealing pediatric cancer funds. And finally, I showed him the digital printout of the offshore wire transfer to Dr. Harrison Webb exactly 48 hours before my life was intentionally and maliciously destroyed. I watched the color completely drain from the old sheriff's weathered face. I watched his calloused hands tremble violently as he recognized my grandfather's neat, meticulous handwriting on the audit ledgers. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. His oldest friend had not died of a random heart attack in his home office. His oldest friend was silenced permanently by the very woman who was currently ruling their town with an iron fist. Sheriff Carter did not offer me empty pity. He did not give me a sympathetic pat on the back. He offered me absolute devastating justice. He told me the local county courts were completely compromised and heavily monitored by Sterling informants, so he bypassed them entirely. He picked up his secure precinct phone and called a federal circuit judge he trusted deeply 3 counties over. Within 6 hours, we had emergency federal warrants signed in completely sealed chambers. Within 12 hours, federal agents had quietly placed highly sophisticated digital wiretaps on every single phone owned by Dr. Harrison Webb and Victoria Sterling. They tapped the country club lines. They tapped the private clinic lines, and they tapped Trent's personal cell phone. Then we simply waited in the shadows for the trap to inevitably snap shut. 2 weeks later, the Sterling family hosted the most lavish, extravagant charity gala in the entire history of the county. Victoria rented out the entire grand ballroom of the Sterling Country Club, shutting down the facility to the general public. It was a spectacular, sickening display of absolute toxic wealth. The massive room was draped in imported white silk and illuminated by giant crystal chandeliers. 300 of the wealthiest, most powerful elites in the state were gathered together to drink $1,000 bottles of imported champagne and eat rare caviar off silver platters. But the truly sickening truth of the night was the dual purpose of the grand celebration. Victoria was using the gala to publicly raise another $5 million for the hospital pediatric oncology wing. She stood on the stage smiling for the flashing cameras, asking wealthy donors to open their checkbooks for sick children. It was $5 million she fully intended to funnel directly into Trent's ghost construction companies by Monday morning. She was actively robbing her own high society friends blind while they clapped for her generosity. And if that was not malicious enough, she was using the exact same stage to announce Abigail's brand new engagement to the entire community. Less than a month after she handed me divorce papers and threw me out into the freezing rain, my wife was already parading a new man around the country club ballroom. He was a wealthy, arrogant banking heir with a massive family trust fund and the pure genetic bloodline Victoria so desperately demanded for her legacy. Abigail was walking around the room wearing a flawless custom designer gown and sporting a massive diamond engagement ring on her finger. She was smiling and laughing, completely erasing our 4-year marriage as if it had never even existed. She looked so perfectly happy, so completely unburdened by the destruction of my life. Victoria and Trent were celebrating their absolute final victory. They thought the working-class parasite was completely dead and buried in a cheap roadside motel. They assumed I had run away in total shame, entirely broken by my fabricated infertility diagnosis and my ruined accounting business. They felt completely invincible standing on that stage surrounded by their bought and paid-for friends. They had absolutely no idea that I was walking straight through the front doors of their exclusive fortress. I did not rent a tuxedo for the occasion. I did not try to blend in with the high society billionaires and the corrupt local politicians. I wore the exact same cheap gray suit I had slept in on the floor of that filthy motel room. My collar was slightly frayed, and my dress shoes were still heavily scuffed from the mud of the industrial storage facility. But as I aggressively pushed open the heavy, solid brass doors of the grand ballroom, I carried myself with an absolute terrifying calm. I was no longer the broken, weeping man begging for his wife to love him. I was the executioner, and I held the blade firmly in my hands. The exact moment I stepped onto the plush red carpet of the ballroom, the ambient classical music seemed to physically slow down. The wealthy guests nearest to the entrance stopped their conversations mid-sentence and turned to stare at me with undisguised shock and profound disgust. The whispers started immediately rippling through the massive room like a contagious virus. They recognized me as the disgraced infertile accountant who had supposedly embezzled money from his own family. They looked at my cheap suit and parted ways, letting me walk straight down the center aisle as if I carried a deadly disease. It only took 10 seconds for Victoria Sterling to spot me from her elevated position on the main stage. Her perfect plastic smile instantly vanished completely, replaced by a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. Her eyes widened in genuine shock, refusing to believe that I had the sheer audacity to show my face in her territory. She aggressively signaled to the armed private security guards positioned around the perimeter of the room, pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest. But before the heavy-set guards could even reach me to drag me out, Trent stepped forward, blocking their path. My arrogant brother-in-law saw a golden opportunity for the ultimate public spectacle. He wanted to destroy me in front of 300 important witnesses to solidify his own fragile ego. He grabbed the microphone from the crystal podium and walked confidently down the center marble staircase directly toward me. His expensive Italian loafers clicked sharply against the stone steps, echoing loudly through the sudden silence of the ballroom. "Well, look who decided to finally crawl out of the gutter," Trent's voice boomed over the massive concert speakers filling every single corner of the room. The 300 wealthy guests fell completely silent, holding their champagne flutes and turning their heads eagerly to watch the live entertainment. I guess the cheap roadside motels do not serve free continental breakfast anymore, so the local trash had to come here to beg for our leftover scraps. The elite crowd let out a low collective murmur of cruel amusement. A few people actually laughed, covering their mouths with their hands. Trent stopped just 5 feet away from me, grinning widely like a predator who had completely cornered his helpless prey. Abigail stood frozen on the stage right behind him, clutching the arm of her new wealthy banking heir, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated embarrassment. She literally turned her head away, unable to even look at the man she once promised to love forever. Trent raised the microphone much closer to his mouth, making sure every single syllable dripped with venomous sarcasm. "What are you even doing here, Wyatt?" he asked, loudly, pacing back and forth in front of me. "Are you here to ask my sister for your weekly allowance? Or maybe you are here to ask the incredibly talented medical doctors in this room if they can finally fix your defective genetics. You know, I heard science is doing amazing things for broken men these days." The sheer targeted cruelty of his words washed heavily over the quiet ballroom. 6 months ago, those exact insults would have broken my spirit completely into pieces. They would have sent me running out the heavy brass doors in tears, utterly consumed by deep psychological shame. I would have believed every single word he said about my worthlessness. But tonight, standing in that room, those words meant absolutely nothing to me. "You really are incredibly pathetic, you know," that Trent continued, his voice rising with aggressive theatrical energy. "You are a complete biological failure. You are a massive financial failure. You are a desperate, infertile beggar trying to crash a party meant for people who actually have a future in this world. Why do you not just do everyone in this room a massive favor and disappear before I have my security team throw you headfirst into the freezing street again?" I stood there completely motionless under the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. I was completely relaxed, my breathing slow and steady, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. I did not shout back at him. I did not try to physically attack him or defend my honor to a room full of corrupt strangers. I just looked directly into Trent's eyes and then slowly shifted my gaze up to Victoria, who was standing rigidly on the stage. She was watching me with a sudden creeping sense of intense unease. My complete lack of fear, my terrifying silence was deeply unsettling to her. She knew how a broken man was supposed to act, and I was not acting broken. I let Trent finish his vicious public monologue, letting him completely dig his own grave in front of 300 witnesses. I did not need to speak because I knew exactly what was waiting right outside those heavy brass doors. I knew that the music in the Sterling Country Club was about to stop permanently, and I was going to watch their entire empire burn to the ground. Trent was standing there, panting slightly from the effort of his own vicious public monologue. The massive grand ballroom was completely silent, waiting for me to break down and cry. 300 of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the state were holding their expensive champagne flutes, holding their breath and watching me like I was a tragic exhibit in a museum of failure. They expected me to hang my head in profound shame. They expected me to turn around and run back out into the freezing rain exactly like the broken, defeated man they believed me to be. But I did not cry. I did not even look at Trent. I treated him exactly like what he was. A loud, completely irrelevant distraction. I looked right past his expensive custom navy blazer and focused my eyes entirely on Abigail. She was standing on the elevated stage, gripping the arm of her new banking heir fiancé. Her face was flushed dark red with extreme embarrassment because I was actively ruining her perfect high society announcement. She looked at my damp, cheap gray suit and my scuffed dress shoes with a mixture of pity and absolute revulsion. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The crowd of elite guests parted slightly, giving me a wide, clear path toward the stage. "Abigail," I said, and my voice carried clearly and steadily across the quiet ballroom without needing a microphone. "I'm going to ask you this one final time. I am asking you right here in front of your mother, in front of your brother, and in front of your brand new fiancé. Do you really believe I was the problem? Do you truly in your heart believe that my genetics were the reason our marriage failed?" The entire room held its collective breath. The tension was so incredibly thick it felt like physical pressure crushing down on my chest. All eyes shifted instantly from me up to the stage. Abigail looked down at me, and for a tiny fraction of a second I saw a flicker of genuine hesitation in her eyes. I saw the ghost of the woman I used to love, the woman who used to sit on our couch and plan our future together. But then she looked over at her mother. Victoria gave her a sharp, commanding nod. It was the silent, absolute order of the sterling matriarch. Abigail straightened her posture. She let go of her new fiancé's arm and looked down at me with absolute freezing disdain. "Yes, Wyatt," she said loudly, making absolutely sure every single wealthy guest could hear her cruel verdict. "You were the problem. You are defective, and you could never give me the powerful legacy I deserve. You are a broken man. Now please get out of my sight before my family has you arrested for trespassing." She turned her back on me completely. She cemented her absolute allegiance to her mother's toxic wealth. She chose the comfortable lie of high society over the difficult truth of our marriage vows. And in doing so, she completely absolved me of any remaining guilt I carried. I had given her one last, desperate chance to choose the truth and stand with me. She threw it away without a second thought. I did not flinch. I did not hang my head. I simply nodded once, accepting her final answer. Trent laughed out loud, stepping aggressively back into my line of sight. "You heard her, parasite." Trent mocked, waving his hand dismissively in my face. "You are officially done here. Security grab this piece of trash and throw him headfirst out into the street." Two massive private security guards wearing tight black suits stepped forward immediately, reaching out their thick hands to grab my shoulders. But before their fingers could even touch my damp suit jacket, the heavy, solid brass doors at the very back of the grand ballroom were violently thrown open. The sound was exactly like a sudden cannon blast. It completely shattered the tense, sophisticated atmosphere of the charity gala. The heavy brass doors slammed hard against the marble walls, echoing loudly across the massive room. Everyone in the ballroom spun around in sheer shock. The two security guards froze dead in their tracks, their hands hovering awkwardly in the air. Sheriff Brody Carter walked through the main entrance. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was not dressed for a charity gala. He was wearing his heavy-duty county sheriff uniform, his bright gold star pinned firmly to his chest, his utility belt heavily loaded with tactical gear. He was a large, incredibly imposing man, with a weathered face carved out of solid granite. And he was not alone. Marching directly behind him, in perfect synchronized tactical formation, were 6 fully armed county deputies. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose, ignoring the wealthy guests and locking their eyes straight ahead. "Turn the music off!" Sheriff Carter barked, his deep voice easily cutting through the massive ballroom acoustics. The terrified young DJ sitting in the elevated booth immediately scrambled in a panic to hit the master mute button. The soft classical ambient music that had been playing faintly in the background died instantly. The total silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. 300 elite guests backed away, terrified of the sudden influx of heavily armed law enforcement officers crashing their exclusive party. Victoria Sterling marched aggressively to the very edge of the stage. Her face was flushed dark purple with absolute blazing fury. She was the undisputed queen of this county, and nobody dared to interrupt her multi-million-dollar charity gala. "Sheriff Carter, what is the exact meaning of this?" Victoria shouted, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at the veteran lawman. "Have you completely lost your mind? This is a private, highly exclusive event. You are blatantly trespassing on Sterling property. I demand that you turn around and march your men out of my ballroom this exact second." Sheriff Carter did not stop walking. He marched straight down the center marble aisle, right past the terrified billionaires, right past the corrupt local politicians, and right past the elite surgeons. He walked right past me, giving me a single, subtle nod of deep respect. He marched directly toward the main stage, stopping just a few feet away from where Victoria stood fuming. "You do not give the orders tonight, Victoria," the sheriff said, his voice booming with absolute unyielding authority. Victoria let out a sharp, offended gasp, crossing her arms tightly over her custom designer gown. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to, Brody?" She sneered intentionally, using his first name to aggressively demean his rank. "I single-handedly fund the police pension program. I pay for the brand new patrol cruisers your pathetic deputies drive. I can make one single phone call to the governor right now and have your shiny badge stripped from your chest before you even walk out of this building. You are destroying my charity event just to harass my family." Trent stepped quickly in front of his mother, trying to play the protective, wealthy air. "You heard her," Carter Trent yelled, trying to sound tough, but his voice cracked slightly. "Get out of our club, or my lawyers will sue this entire county department into total permanent bankruptcy." Sheriff Carter ignored Trent completely. He did not even look at the arrogant 30-year-old trust fund baby. He simply gestured casually with his thick, calloused hand. Two county deputies instantly broke formation and walked straight up the marble stairs of the stage. They flanked Victoria and Trent, standing silently just inches away from them, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. The physical intimidation was absolute. The wealthy guests in the front rows began whispering frantically, stepping backward to avoid any potential physical crossfire. Victoria looked at the armed deputies and then glared down at Sheriff Carter. Her chest was heaving with profound indignation. "This is a massive career-ending mistake, Carter," she warned, her voice dropping an octave into a dangerous, threatening hiss. "I will absolutely destroy your life for this public humiliation. I will make sure you lose your pension and end up working as a miserable night watchman at a dying shopping mall." Sheriff Carter stopped right at the base of the marble stairs. He looked up at Victoria, and his weathered face twisted into a look of profound, absolute disgust. He was looking at the exact woman who had maliciously murdered his best friend 5 years ago. He was looking at the woman who had systematically destroyed my life just to protect her stolen wealth. "Your desperate phone calls will not save you tonight," Victoria, the sheriff said, his voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any fear. "Because the people you usually call to corruptly clean up your miserable messes are the exact same people who signed the federal warrants I am currently executing." The word federal hung in the cold air like a massive physical weight. The color instantly drained completely from Victoria's face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. The arrogant, untouchable fire in her eyes flickered and died instantly, replaced by a sudden, creeping, paralyzing panic. She knew she absolutely controlled the local county judges, but federal warrants meant her local political power was completely useless. She was trapped. Sheriff Carter turned away from her. He walked purposefully over to the elevated DJ booth located just to the right of the main stage. The young DJ stood up, holding his hands high in the air, utterly terrified of the large, grim lawman. "Step aside, son," the sheriff commanded. The DJ scrambled frantically out of the booth, knocking over a chair in his haste to escape. Sheriff Carter reached into his heavy uniform pocket and pulled out his thick black smartphone. He looked down at the massive, complex mixing board. He reached out and grabbed the main auxiliary audio cord, the specific wire that connected directly to the massive concert speakers suspended from the ballroom ceiling. He pulled the cord out of the DJ mixer and plugged it firmly into the bottom of his smartphone. The entire ballroom watched in absolute stunned silence. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to move a single muscle. Abigail was clutching her new fiancé's arm, looking back and forth between her mother and the sheriff with wide, terrified, uncomprehending eyes. Trent was standing rigidly, his arrogant smirk completely wiped off his face, replaced by a look of sheer physical nausea. Sheriff Carter tapped the glowing screen of his smartphone once. He looked directly at Victoria and spoke into his police radio microphone, which amplified his deep voice perfectly through his shoulder speaker. "You have been stealing from pediatric cancer funds for nearly a decade, Victoria," the sheriff said, his voice ringing out clearly across the massive room. "You murdered William Sullivan in his own home to cover your tracks, and when you realized his grandson might eventually catch on, you decided to violently destroy his marriage. You thought you were untouchable. You thought your money made you an invisible god. But you forgot that digital financial networks leave a permanent, unchangeable trail. And desperate, guilty men make very loud mistakes." He tapped the bright green play button on his phone screen. A sharp, aggressive burst of digital static echoed violently out of the massive concert speakers. It was so incredibly loud that several elite guests physically jumped backward in fright. Then a frantic voice filled the enormous grand ballroom. It was a voice every single wealthy person in that room recognized instantly. It was the polished, highly educated voice of Dr. Harrison Webb. But he did not sound polished right now. He sounded completely hysterical, frantic, and utterly terrified for his life. "Victoria, pick up the phone." The recorded voice of Dr. Webb echoed off the bright crystal chandeliers bouncing off the high ceilings. "Victoria, you need to answer me right now. The feds are inside my clinic. Do you hear me? Federal agents just walked right into my private medical clinic with cardboard boxes and search warrants. They are pulling my private server hard drives. They are actively looking into the hospital foundation accounts." A loud collective gasp swept entirely through the grand ballroom. 300 wealthy elites stared up at the speakers in absolute pure shock. Victoria physically stumbled backward on the stage as if she had just been shot in the chest. She reached out blindly and grabbed the heavy crystal podium, desperately trying to stop herself from collapsing onto the floor. The audio recording continued the sheer panic in Dr. Webb's voice, escalating into a high-pitched, terrified scream. "You promised me this was totally secure, Victoria. You promised me that $50,000 bribe to fake Wyatt Sullivan's fertility labs would never leave a paper trail. You told me the offshore account was completely untraceable. You said you just needed a medical excuse to completely ruin your daughter's marriage and force him out of the family before he looked at the trust accounts." Abigail let out a piercing, horrifying scream. Her hands flew to her mouth and her fingers went completely numb. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped straight from her hand and shattered violently against the hard marble floor of the stage. The sharp, loud sound of the breaking glass cut through the quiet room like a cracking whip. She spun around and stared directly at her mother. Her eyes were completely wide with absolute, unadulterated terror and profound, earth-shattering betrayal. Dr. Webb's recorded voice shrieked one final, devastating threat over the massive speakers. "If I lose my entire medical license and go to federal prison because you wanted to ruin your daughter's marriage to protect your stolen charity money, I am not going to prison alone. Do you hear me, Victoria? I am taking you down with me. I will tell the federal agents absolutely everything." The recording clicked off with a sharp, sudden snap. The deafening silence that violently rushed back into the ballroom was infinitely heavier than solid concrete. The absolute devastating magnitude of the public revelation crashed down aggressively on the crowd. The beloved charity patron, the undisputed queen of the county society, was nothing but a common thief who actively stole from sick, dying children and maliciously paid a doctor to mentally castrate her own loyal son-in-law. The sheer absolute evil of the conspiracy was almost entirely impossible for the high society guests to immediately comprehend. But the undeniable digital proof had just been broadcast at maximum volume to every single important connected person in the state. "Mom!" Abigail screamed, her voice tearing violently at the seams. Her perfect, flawless high society composure completely disintegrated into raw, agonizing panic. "Mom, what is he talking about? Tell me that is a lie. Tell me you did not pay him to fake Wyatt's test results. Tell me you did not force me to throw away my husband." Victoria could not speak a single word. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. She was completely, utterly paralyzed, staring blankly at the massive speakers as her entire prestigious empire instantly evaporated into thin air. Trent, however, did not freeze. The exact moment the audio recording ended, Trent suddenly realized that his totally fake ghost construction companies were the absolute next target on the federal warrant list. The arrogant trust fund heir panicked completely. He shoved aggressively past his crying sister, violently pushed one of the armed county deputies out of his way, and made a desperate, pathetic full-speed sprint for the side exit of the main stage. He did not even make it 5 steps. A heavy-set, extremely large county deputy stepped directly into his escape path and drove a solid, muscular shoulder straight into Trent's chest. The brutal physical impact lifted Trent completely off his expensive Italian loafers. He crashed down incredibly hard onto the slick marble floor, sliding several feet and slamming forcefully into the heavy stone base of a massive decorative floral arrangement. A giant glass vase filled with white lilies tipped over and shattered, pouring gallons of freezing cold water all over his tailored, expensive navy blazer. 2 deputies immediately pounced on him, pinning his arms forcefully and painfully behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of solid steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Trent's wrists echoed loudly and beautifully across the quiet room. Trent squirmed helplessly in the spilled muddy water and broken glass, crying loudly and screaming frantically that he wanted his expensive lawyers. Sheriff Carter walked slowly and deliberately up the marble stairs onto the main stage. He reached around to his belt and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather pouch. He walked directly up to Victoria Sterling. Victoria Sterling. Sheriff Carter said, his voice low, cold, and as hard as stone. "You are officially under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny conspiracy to commit medical fraud, and the massive embezzlement of hospital charity funds. Turn around right now and place your hands flat behind your back." Victoria finally snapped out of her paralyzed, silent shock. She let out a wild, desperate, hysterical scream. She thrashed her arms wildly, aggressively, refusing to comply with the legal order. "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, her perfect, carefully styled hair falling messily and wildly across her panicked face. "I am Victoria Sterling. You work for me. You all work for me. I completely own this town. I will have you all fired immediately. I will entirely destroy your miserable lives." Sheriff Carter did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He grabbed her thin wrists with absolute practiced professional force, forcefully twisting her arms painfully behind her back. Victoria screamed loudly in physical pain and profound total humiliation as the cold, heavy steel cuffs locked tightly and securely around her wrists. The untouchable, wealthy queen of the county was officially standing in chains. I walked slowly and calmly up the marble stairs of the stage. The massive crowd watched me in total, complete silence. They no longer saw a disgraced, broken, infertile man begging for scraps. They saw the calm, highly calculating man who had just single-handedly detonated the most powerful, ruthless family in the region without throwing a single physical punch. I stopped right in front of Victoria. She was breathing heavily, rapidly, straining uselessly against the massive sheriff's iron grip, glaring at me with wide eyes full of venom and pure, helpless hatred. "You did this, you miserable, filthy parasite," she spat forcefully, the bitter words flying wetly from her mouth. "You completely ruined my family." I casually reached up and adjusted the damp lapels of my cheap gray suit jacket. I looked at her with absolutely zero anger, zero sadness, and zero pity. I did not feel the crushing weight of the last few weeks anymore. I just felt completely, profoundly clean. "You bought a lie, Victoria," I whispered, leaning in closely so only she could hear the final absolute truth of her destruction. But the truth is entirely free. The fallout was not just swift. It was an absolute financial massacre. The moment the heavy steel handcuffs locked around Victoria Sterling's wrists inside that grand ballroom, the entire carefully constructed illusion of her generational wealth completely disintegrated. Federal agents did not just arrest her and place her in the back of a police cruiser. They executed a highly coordinated massive sweep of her entire criminal empire. By Monday morning, the Federal Bureau had completely frozen every single banking account, trust fund, and offshore asset tied to the Sterling name. The local community bank that had so eagerly helped Victoria freeze my accounting business suddenly found itself under severe federal investigation for failing to report highly suspicious wire transfers. The corrupt bank manager who had treated me like a criminal over the phone was fired immediately and federally indicted by Wednesday afternoon. The absolute destruction of the Sterling family was broadcast live on every single local news channel in the state. I was sitting in a quiet diner sipping a hot cup of coffee when I watched their complete public humiliation unfold on the television screen mounted above the counter. Two heavy-duty commercial tow trucks pulled right up to the massive wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate. The Internal Revenue Service had officially moved in right behind the federal agents. They discovered that Victoria had been using her stolen hospital charity money to illegally write off her massive personal debts. The IRS placed an immediate emergency tax lien on the $4 million Sterling mansion to cover the millions of dollars stolen from the Pediatric Oncology Foundation. I watched the live news feed as federal marshals dragged Trent out of his front door. My arrogant brother-in-law was standing in the freezing morning air, wearing silk pajamas, screaming wildly at the news cameras and frantically threatening to sue the federal government. But his empty trust fund threats meant absolutely nothing to the federal authorities. The tow truck drivers hooked heavy steel chains to his custom-imported Porsche and his luxury sport utility vehicle. I watched the exact same commercial towing company that had taken my modest sedan legally drag Trent's expensive cars right out of the muddy driveway. Trent stood in the wet grass, crying loudly like a helpless, terrified child, while the entire county watched him lose his completely unearned status in real time. Within 48 hours, a giant red foreclosure notice was stapled directly to the custom mahogany front door of the Sterling estate. The elite country club that had served as Victoria's personal throne room held an emergency executive board meeting that same night. Terrified of the catastrophic public relations nightmare of being directly associated with a convicted charity embezzler, the club permanently revoked the Sterling family memberships. They mailed a formal letter of banishment that was leaked directly to the press. The Sterlings were officially exiled from the high society they had ruthlessly ruled for decades. When Abigail tried to call her wealthy elite friends for help, every single one of them had already blocked her phone number. They went from being untouchable local royalty to absolute social pariahs in less than a single week. While the Sterling family empire burned violently to the ground, I was busy quietly taking my life back. The federal judge overseeing the embezzlement case had reviewed my grandfather's meticulous audit ledgers and immediately lifted the fraudulent legal injunction on my commercial property. I walked back into my independent accounting firm exactly 10 days after I had been violently thrown out. The building felt cold and completely abandoned, but it belonged to me again. I did not hire a professional cleaning crew or an expensive contractor to fix the place up. I went to the local hardware store, bought 3 gallons of fresh paint, and started rolling it onto the walls myself. I wanted to feel the physical, exhausting labor of rebuilding my own foundation. I wanted the strong smell of fresh paint to completely erase the sterile smell of the cheap roadside motel. I was standing on a wooden ladder, wearing an old pair of paint-splattered jeans, when I heard the heavy glass front door of my office slowly push open. I climbed down the ladder and wiped my hands on a cotton rag, expecting to see a returning client or a local delivery driver. Instead, I saw my wife. Or rather, I saw the completely broken, hollow shell of the woman I used to call my wife. Abigail stood in the small reception area, looking absolutely unrecognizable. The custom designer dresses, the expensive diamond jewelry, and the flawless high society confidence were completely gone. She was wearing a pair of cheap, faded gray sweatpants and a shapeless, oversized sweater that looked like it had not been washed in days. Her hair was pulled into a messy, chaotic knot, and her face was pale and entirely devoid of makeup. I immediately noticed that the massive, sparkling diamond engagement ring from the wealthy banking heir was missing from her left hand. The exact moment her new fiancé realized the sterling money was completely fake, and that his own prestigious family name was about to be dragged into a massive federal criminal trial, he had abandoned her immediately. He ran away from the toxic scandal, leaving Abigail completely alone to face the catastrophic ruins of her mother's horrific crimes. "Wyatt," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically in the quiet, empty office. I did not move toward her. I stood firmly in the center of the room, holding the paint rag. I did not feel any sudden surge of anger. I did not feel any lingering trace of romantic love or a desperate desire to comfort her. I simply looked at her with an overwhelming, profound sense of pity. I was looking at a woman who had traded her entire soul for a bank account that did not even exist. She took 3 hesitant, shaky steps forward, and then her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto her knees, right on the thin, commercial carpet of my waiting room. She buried her face in her trembling hands and started sobbing uncontrollably. It was not the elegant, theatrical crying she had performed in Dr. Harrison Webb's clinic. It was the raw, ugly, terrifying panic of a woman who had just realized she had absolutely nothing left in the world. "Please, Wyatt," she begged, looking up at me with thick tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Please forgive me. You have to understand that I was not thinking clearly. My mother manipulated me. She completely brainwashed me my entire life. She made me believe that keeping the Sterling bloodline pure and protecting our social status was the only thing that mattered in this world. When the doctor told us you were infertile, she got inside my head. She told me I was saving my own future by leaving you. She said you would only drag me down. I was a victim of her horrible lies, just like you were." I listened to her desperate, pathetic excuses echoing off the freshly painted walls. She was desperately clinging to the very last shred of hope that I would be the good, loyal, forgiving man I had always been. She was hoping I would bend down, pick her up off the dirty floor, and offer her a safe, warm harbor from the incredible, devastating storm her own family had aggressively created. She wanted me to be her savior because her mother was sitting in a federal holding cell and her brother was bankrupt. "We can start over," she pleaded, crawling slightly forward on her knees, reaching out with a shaking hand to grab the frayed hem of my jeans. "We can go back to how we were before all of this absolute madness happened. We can find a new doctor. We can look into private adoption just like you wanted. We can build our beautiful family together, Wyatt. I love you. I never stopped loving you. I just made a terrible, horrible mistake because I was scared." I looked down at her hands, desperately clutching the rough fabric of my jeans. I gently but extremely firmly reached down and pulled her fingers away, stepping backward to create a clear physical boundary between us. "You do not get to use the word love anymore, Abigail," I said, my voice completely calm, analytical, and undeniably cold. She looked up at me, her red, swollen eyes wide with frantic panic. "Wyatt, please, you have to listen to me. I was completely manipulated. I did not know she was stealing from pediatric cancer patients. I did not know she paid the doctor to fake your lab results." I held up my hand, stopping her desperate, rambling words instantly. "I know you did not know about the stolen hospital money," I told her, staring directly into her terrified eyes. I know you had absolutely no idea your mother was running a massive criminal enterprise. If you had known about the embezzlement, you would have been arrested and handcuffed right alongside her and Trent in that ballroom. But your sheer ignorance of her financial crimes does not excuse what you deliberately did to me in our marriage. She opened her mouth to aggressively argue to defend her actions, but I did not let her speak another syllable. I had spent 4 long years staying quiet to keep the peace in her wealthy family, and I was never going to be quiet again. You did not leave me because of a medical diagnosis, Abigail. I said delivering the absolute brutal truth of our broken relationship. You left me because the exact moment our life together got difficult, you chose the comfortable, luxurious safety of your mother's toxic money over the sacred vows you made to me. You looked at a man who loved you deeply, who provided for you, and who begged you to stand by him as a team, and you threw him away like a piece of defective trash. You did not fight for us. You did not even hesitate for a single second. You just ran right back to the country club, kicked me out into the freezing rain, and put on a new diamond ring. Wyatt? No, she sobbed, shaking her head frantically from side to side, her tears falling onto the carpet. That is not true. Yes, it is, I said, my voice dropping to a hard, unforgiving tone that left absolutely no room for debate. You are exactly who Victoria raised you to be. You only want me back right now because the federal government took your massive mansion, because your rich banking fiancé abandoned you, and because I am the literal only person left in this county who knows how to actually survive without a stolen trust fund. You do not miss me, Abigail. You just miss having someone to pay your bills and provide a roof over your head. I turned around and walked purposefully over to my heavy metal desk. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a thick, familiar blue folder. It was the exact same blue folder she had proudly handed to me in our kitchen on the day she legally demanded I vacate our home. I walked back over to where she was still kneeling pathetically on the floor and dropped the folder right in front of her trembling knees. Those are the finalized divorce papers, I stated firmly, looking down at her one last time. I had my new lawyer expedite the absolute dissolution of our marriage based on extreme, irreconcilable differences and profound marital fraud. I kept the house that I paid for. I kept my independent accounting business. You get absolutely nothing from me ever again. Sign the bottom page and leave the documents on the reception desk. She stared at the blue folder lying on the carpet, her entire body shaking violently with the absolute devastating reality of her situation. She realized in that exact terrifying moment that her tears, her manipulation, and her apologies were completely useless. The door to my life and my protection was permanently locked. I turned my back on her completely, picked up my paint roller, and walked back over to the tall wooden ladder. I have a lot of work to do to get my firm running again, I said, picking up where I left off and not looking back at her. Please lock the front door on your way out. A few months after Abigail walked out of my freshly painted office for the last time, the federal government officially closed their massive investigation into the Sterling family. The sheer scale of the financial crimes Victoria had committed against the Pediatric Charity Foundation sent absolute shockwaves through the entire state. The federal prosecutors were ruthless and thorough. They dismantled every single shell company, every hidden offshore account, and every forged construction contract that my grandfather had meticulously tracked. Because I had handed the federal authorities the exact digital blueprints to a multi-million-dollar embezzlement ring, I qualified for a substantial reward under the Federal Whistleblower Protection Program. The government compensates individuals who expose massive corporate and municipal fraud by awarding them a percentage of the recovered stolen funds. When the official certified letter from the Department of Justice arrived in my mailbox, it contained a settlement check for an amount of money that completely defied my working-class imagination. It was enough money to instantly buy my way into the exact same high society circles that had just violently rejected me. I could have easily purchased a massive gated mansion on a hill. I could have bought a custom imported sports car to replace the modest sedan Trent had towed away. I could have flaunted my brand new massive wealth in front of every single corrupt local politician and elite doctor who had turned a blind eye to my destruction. But I had absolutely no desire to become the very thing I had just destroyed. I knew exactly what toxic, unearned wealth did to a human soul. I had watched it completely rot my mother-in-law from the inside out, and I had watched it strip my former wife of her basic humanity. I took the federal whistleblower money, and I went straight to the local community library. It was the exact same quiet, modest brick library where my grandfather, William Sullivan, used to take me every single Saturday afternoon when I was a little boy. He used to sit with me at a worn wooden table and teach me how to read complex financial ledgers, teaching me that numbers were the only universal language that absolutely never lied. I met with the library board of directors, and I completely funded the construction of a massive brand new educational wing. I paid for new computers, thousands of new books, and a comprehensive financial literacy center for low-income families. Right above the main entrance to the new addition, I had a heavy, solid bronze plaque permanently installed. It simply read, "The William Sullivan Memorial Wing, dedicated to a man who measured his life in absolute truth." I stood in the quiet lobby on the day the wing officially opened, looking up at my grandfather's name. Victoria Sterling had tried to erase him from history, calling him a paranoid paper pusher. Now his name was permanently etched in bronze, a lasting monument to his unyielding integrity, while her name was printed on a federal prison jumpsuit. With my grandfather's legacy fully restored, I poured my own energy back into the only thing I knew how to do perfectly. I vastly expanded my independent accounting firm. I hired 3 young, brilliant junior accountants who came from the exact same working-class neighborhoods I grew up in. We did not take on wealthy, elite clients looking to hide their money in offshore tax havens. We specifically aggressively targeted clients who were being preyed upon by the exact kind of corrupt shell companies Victoria Sterling used to operate. I took on local plumbers, mechanics, carpenters, and small bakery owners. When predatory corporate lenders tried to seize their modest family businesses using confusing legal loopholes or accelerated commercial debt clauses, my firm stepped in like a brick wall. We audited the massive banks, we completely dismantled their aggressive contracts, and we legally forced them to back down. I used the exact same forensic accounting skills that took down the Sterling Empire to protect the honest, hardworking people of my community. Every single time I saved a family business from foreclosure, I felt the crushing weight of my past slowly lifting off my shoulders. I was building a fortress of honest labor. But despite my growing business success and my restored professional reputation, there was still one incredibly dark shadow lingering deep in my mind. The heavy, suffocating ghost of Dr. Harrison Webb still haunted my quiet moments. Even though I knew Victoria had bribed him to fabricate my medical records to destroy my marriage, the psychological damage of being told you are biologically worthless does not just magically disappear overnight. For an entire year, I carried that deeply ingrained fear. I was absolutely terrified to walk into another medical clinic. I was paralyzed by the irrational, horrible thought that maybe the corrupt doctor had accidentally told the truth while telling a lie. What if I really was a genetic dead end? What if I truly was incapable of ever fathering a child? That fear kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my new bedroom, wondering if my future would always be completely empty. Finally, I realized I could not live the rest of my life hiding from a medical chart. I needed the absolute, undeniable truth about my own body. I did not go to a prestigious private hospital with crystal chandeliers and valets. I drove 2 towns over to a modest family medical practice run by an older, quiet physician who had spent his entire career treating local factory workers and public school teachers. His waiting room did not smell like expensive perfume or high society arrogance. It just smelled cleanly of rubbing alcohol and old magazines. I sat on the cheap vinyl exam table, my hands sweating profusely, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I explained my entire medical history to the new doctor, leaving out the criminal trial, but explaining the severe diagnosis I had been given the year before. He listened patiently without a single drop of judgment and drew the necessary blood panels. The waiting period for the laboratory results was the longest, most agonizing week of my entire life. Every time my phone rang, my breath caught sharply in my throat. When the doctor finally called and asked me to come into the office to discuss the results in person, I felt entirely numb. I drove to the clinic, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped. I walked into his small, cluttered office and sat down in a simple wooden chair, bracing myself for the absolute worst. The doctor opened the manila folder on his desk and looked up at me with a warm, genuinely confused smile. "Wyatt," he said softly, pushing the laboratory printouts directly across the desk toward me. "I am not entirely sure what the previous physician was looking at, but these results are completely flawless. I ran the comprehensive genetic microdeletion panels twice just to be absolutely certain. You do not have any chromosomal anomalies. You are completely perfectly healthy. Your fertility levels are actually well above average for a man your age. There is absolutely zero biological reason why you cannot father as many children as you want." I sat rigidly in the wooden chair, staring blankly at the black ink on the white paper. The words "completely, perfectly healthy" echoed over and over again in my mind. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the laboratory report. I read the numbers. I read the medical conclusions. They were real. They were honest. The absolute final lingering chain that Victoria Sterling had aggressively wrapped around my soul violently snapped and fell completely away. I was not a biological failure. I was not a defective product. I was a healthy, whole man with an entire lifetime of possibilities stretching out wide open in front of me. I walked out of that medical clinic and got into my car. I shut the heavy door, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet parking lot. I gripped the steering wheel, pressed my forehead against my hands, and wept. I did not cry tears of grief or humiliation or shame. I cried massive, heavy tears of pure, unadulterated relief. I wept for the beautiful future children I would eventually hold in my arms. I wept for the incredible family I was now completely free to build with a woman who would love me for my heart and not my bank account. The nightmare was finally permanently over. Today I am sitting on the wide, wraparound wooden porch of a beautiful, modest farmhouse. I bought this property with the honest, clean money I earned from rebuilding my own accounting firm. The house is surrounded by 50 acres of quiet, peaceful land. There are no wrought iron gates to keep the world out. There are no country club memberships to maintain. There is just the sound of the wind moving softly through the tall oak trees and the smell of fresh rain on the open soil. I am drinking a simple cup of black coffee, watching the sun slowly set over the distant horizon. My life is entirely predictable, completely domestic, and absolutely beautiful. When I look back at the devastating day I was thrown out into the freezing rain with nothing but a rusty key, I realize how incredibly skewed our modern society has become. We live in a world that constantly desperately tries to measure a man's ultimate worth by the size of his bank account, the brand of his suit, or the labels violently slapped onto him by people in positions of power. Victoria Sterling looked at me and only saw a working-class parasite because my hands were calloused and my car was cheap. Abigail looked at me and only saw a biological failure because she trusted the expensive, polished lie of a corrupt physician over the quiet, steady love of her own husband. They completely, fundamentally believed that their wealth made them untouchable gods who could bend reality to their vicious will. But they were wrong. They failed to understand that real, lasting power does not come from a trust fund or a massive commercial mortgage. Real power comes from the absolute, unbreakable ability to look at the total destruction of your own life and decide to slowly build it all back, brick by honest brick. They threw me away because they thought I was weak. But the very struggles they mocked were the exact tools I used to tear their fraudulent empire completely down. I am a certified public accountant. I know that every single ledger eventually balances itself out, The debt of their cruelty finally came due, and the universe collected it in full. They tried to strip me of my dignity, my business, and my future. But what they did not know is that when you take everything from a man who knows how to rebuild you, just give him a clean foundation. If you have ever had your worth determined by people who measure life in dollars and lies, share this story. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to rebuild your life from zero. And do not forget to subscribe, because sometimes the greatest inheritance is not a trust fund, it is the truth.